I was driving home when I realized a truck had been behind me for miles. Just to be precautious, I made an abrupt last-second U-turn, and he did too. It was there that I realized he was following me. While on the phone with 911, I made sharp turns and ran red lights to try to lose him. He wouldn't stop, literally almost hitting my car a couple of times as he sped up trying to catch me. The 911 operator instructed me to go to a local grocery store and wait for the police. I parked right in front of the store's entrance, surveillance cameras, and waited. He decided to park his car at a distance and waited for me to get out of my car. All of a sudden, I heard a hard knock at my window. I freaked out, and it turned out to be the grocery manager letting me know 911 just notified him of the situation. He asked if I wanted to go inside the store and he would protect me until the cops arrived. I honestly feared the worst and told him no. I was shaking, but I thought, this maniac might have a gun. He could shoot me and everyone in there. Cops arrived and luckily cornered him in the back of the parking structure. I was shaking as they came to my car, my hand gripping the wheel very tightly. They arrested him soon after for a third DUI and police filed a report. I didn't know who he was. Apparently, he lived a couple of miles away from me. Unfortunately, 2 months later, I received a letter to notify me that I may be subpoenaed. I called the DMV, who issued the letter, and they notified me that not only is he free again, but that my information, including my address, were on the police report that was provided to him and his attorney. Thanks, LAPD. I now live in fear he may come any day and hurt me. This happened 6 months ago, and I recently took an Uber for the first time since this incident, so I thought I'd share. I was leaving a work function at a bar around midnight in a large city about an hour away from the suburban home I share with my partner. For reference, I'm a woman in my mid-20s with an average build. Not tall, not strong, definitely not threatening in any way, and I was a bit buzzed that night. I'm talking like 3 drinks, so not incapacitated in the slightest. Anyway, I ordinarily take a company car home, but I hadn't reserved one since I didn't know what time I'd be leaving, so I just decided to Uber. The company reimburses me for the bill anyway, so it was no difference to me. Once the Uber pulls up, I say goodbye to my colleagues and get in the back seat. I'm always very nice to my Uber drivers, so I introduce myself. This driver, let's call him Ed since I don't actually know his real name, seemed totally normal. No red flags, and we make pleasant conversation for about 15 minutes until we are squarely out of the city on the way to the suburbs. From this pleasant conversation, I learn he lives in a certain neighborhood not far from my own home. Note that his neighborhood, while relatively nearby, would be completely out of the way on the route we are taking to my home. The conversation reaches its natural end, so I just stay a bit quiet and start looking at my phone. The quiet is interrupted by his voice, suggesting I take a nap if I feel tired. It didn't even strike me as weird at first, so I just thanked him for the offer, but I wasn't that tired. He then said, "Oh, I always get sleepy when I'm drunk. Are you sure?" At this point, something in my body made me even more wide awake than before. I replied that I wasn't drunk, and like I said, I just had a few drinks, so no need to nap. I'll be home soon enough anyways. He drops it after that, but I still thought it was weird he'd said that. About 5 minutes later, he says the highway has some weird construction going on, and that the single-lane traffic ahead would make my trip way longer than it needs to be. He asks if it's okay to take another route. I oblige, already on edge and just wanting to be at home. My partner calls at that moment asking when I'll be home, and I make sure to make it very clear I was talking to my significant other. Something was weird about this guy, and I wanted him to know that someone is expecting me at a specific time and knows where I am. After I hang up the phone, the Uber driver stays quiet, and we get off the highway on a different exit than I've ever used, but I guess that's to be expected on a different route home. I'm messing around on my phone because I don't want to talk to this guy anymore, not even looking up until he says, "My house is only 5 minutes from here." Okay, I think. In the pit of my stomach, something feels strange. I'm probably a good 25 minutes away from my house right now, a distance enlarged, I'd later learn artificially by his shortcut. I say some nonsense about how I like the neighborhood and how my boyfriend and I were thinking of moving here instead. Blah blah, basically anything I can think of to make it seem like I don't think this is weird and I'm not picking up on any signals. Surprisingly, he doesn't say anything in response and now starts driving on a road in a direction I knew led to my house. Phew, crisis averted, right? Except not really. 15 minutes to go and my surroundings are more familiar. Just as I'm starting to feel more at ease, he starts asking questions about my boyfriend. What does he do? How long have we been together? And other seemingly normal questions. Finally, with about 10 minutes to go, he asks if my boyfriend makes me happy. He does, very much so, so I blush a bit and say, yeah, he makes me very happy. Then he asks if I make him happy. I thought that was weird, but humor is my defense mechanism, so I say, well, I should hope so. 8 minutes away, he turns onto a side street and pulls over on the side of the road. He looks back at me over his headrest and asks if I'd make him happy too. I said, what? Mostly because I can't believe what's happening. He asks again, do you want to make me happy tonight? I took a second to think through my options. I'm alone with this guy who's behind the wheel. The street is dark and I don't see any lights on at nearby houses. Close to 1 a.m. at this point on a weeknight. I don't know what this guy has in the car. I default to the response many women know to be the true barrier to men's advances. I don't think my boyfriend would like that very much. His weird grin falls away from his face and he says, he doesn't have to find out. Come on, make me happy. I know a few ways you can start. I tell him my boyfriend is expecting me home any minute. Besides, I love him and I don't want to hurt him. Can you please just take me home? I carry a small knife and a little canister of mace, but all I could think of was to appeal to this guy's sensitive side, I guess. Somehow, it worked and he didn't say another word after that, just turned back around and silently drove me home. Weirdly enough, I say thanks as I get out of the car. Old habits die hard, I guess, and that was that. I go into my house and start crying immediately for some reason as soon as I hug my partner. He tells me I need to contact Uber immediately and tell them what happened so that this guy doesn't try to take advantage of anyone else. I agree and pull up the app to file the complaint. Except when I look at my last ride, the picture in the profile was 100% not the same guy who drove me home. The car was the same, but not the driver. The guy in the photo was brown and wore a turban, maybe early 40s. The guy who drove me home was white and seemed just a bit older than me. Uber never followed up with me and just refunded my money. I did tell the police what happened because my partner insisted, but they didn't take me seriously since nothing actually happened. I was worried for a while since the guy knew where I lived, but apparently it's long forgotten since I just took an Uber today. Moral of the story: always make sure the photo in your Uber driver's profile matches the person who's driving the car. I took a CPR class at my local Red Cross yesterday. I sat next to a man who was probably around 30 to 40 years old. He said he was there because of work. He appeared to have a combination of not having a firm grasp on English and not paying attention, since he either didn't understand or didn't care about the things that were being taught. We were paired together on one exercise where we were supposed to do a head-to-toe examination. I told him I preferred not to be touched and that I preferred to just move my arms, hands, and chest, etc. to show I wasn't injured. He didn't listen and started touching my hands, my arms, and my thighs. I told him I preferred not to be touched twice before he listened. When it was my turn to ask him questions, he said, "I think we should go watch them to learn," and pointed to two men who were doing the exercise. On our lunch break, I decided to go and sit in my car and eat some lunch I brought. He waved at me sitting in my car and walked a few blocks down to the Dunkin' Donuts to get a coffee. When we were sitting during the lecture, he passed me a note asking me to drive him to the hospital about 10 minutes down the street. I felt guilty, thinking that he needed to get to the hospital, but also nervous. I texted my mom asking what I should do. She said, "No, don't do it. There's a shuttle that goes between the Red Cross and the hospital. He can figure it out on his own." I wrote him a note telling him I was going in the opposite direction and told him about the shuttle. He stared at me and looked very offended and upset. While we were practicing the CPR, he whispers to me, "Why can you not drive? I have to wait for the shuttle." I told him it was going out of my way and I had other things to do. When the class went out, I paused near the elevators to make a call. When I went out to my car, he was standing next to the passenger side. When he saw me, he pulled on the door and said, "Unlock this door?" I said, "No, I told you I wasn't going to give you a ride." And he says, "I don't understand you." "I'm not giving you a ride," I said. "You're very selfish," he told me. I unlocked just the front door of the car and got in quickly, locking the doors again. He was still staring, looking very angry. He grabbed onto the door handle, not pulling on it, just holding, even after I turned the car on. After doing this for a minute, with us having a stare down, he rapped on my window with his knuckles and just walked away. I was able to drive away safely. I felt very thankful that I didn't say yes. When I was about 8 years old, my mother and I lived in a small town, in a building with small apartments and rooms that people could rent, live in, or leave whenever. My mother was super poor, so it was all we could afford, a tiny apartment with neighbors changing every week. My then best friend Cassandra, who was also 8 years old, used to come spend the night every Saturday. We would usually go play in the long corridors of the building in the same floor as our apartment, and if it wasn't cold and rainy, we'd go out in the parking lot to play. That's what we did that day, but my mother didn't like it when we weren't close to her, so after 10 minutes of playing, I told Cassandra we should get back in before we got in trouble. Just as I was opening the entrance door to the building with my keys, some tall, thin man in his 30s literally appeared out of nowhere from behind us to hold the door for us. We thanked him, obviously thinking nothing of it. I never saw him before, but like I said, anyone could rent and leave even if it was just for one day, so it wasn't weird to see someone I wasn't used to seeing around. He kept smiling and started talking to us and following us to the elevator. He was genuinely smiling, like he was so happy to see us and talk to us. As we waited for the elevator to come, he kept asking us questions like, "What floor do we live on? What's your name and age? How long have you known each other for?" Just random questions to which we responded truthfully. We went into the elevator. He pressed on floor 2 and I pressed floor 4. When the door of the elevator closed, he started getting creepier. He told us how pretty we were, how he liked our hair, how it was perfect that I was dark-haired and my friend blonde. He told me that I seemed to have a really nice body, how nice that I was tall and slender. This didn't come across as weird or creepy to my 8-year-old brain because a very friendly old female neighbor that used to live next to us always told me that I should model for kids' clothes, and she used to say she wished she had my body when she was younger. So him giving me compliments about my body wasn't a red flag. I smiled and thanked him. Floor 2 was his floor. The elevators opened and he prevents the doors from closing again. No one was around. Now I was starting to think that he was being weird. He told us that he worked for the television and that he was a photographer for magazines. He said he was quite reputed and that he dealt with models, celebrities, etc. He said that he thinks we have potential, and that's why he complimented us. He said he thought we'd make it big if he took pictures and videos of us, that we'd be on magazines and on television. He said he'd take pictures of us in a bikini and cute little dresses. My friend was excited about it. I was too, but for some reason I was very skeptical. He told us to follow him to his room and we'd see how he wasn't messing with us, that he'd show us his professional camera and said he was used to taking pictures of kids and he made some of them very popular. He said he had candies and toys we could keep. I said that I should talk to my mother first. He said, "No, don't tell your parents. Parents want you to stay in school. Only tell them after I took pictures and videos of you two, and when your parents see them and you become very popular, they'll be okay with it." That's exactly what he said. I remember every single word, and I'm 23 years old now. The whole "I made kids popular before, your parents will see the pictures and videos, you'll be on TV and magazines" thing sounds very creepy and sinister now that I know what he actually was. Before I could say anything else, my friend walked out of the elevator and told me to come. He was grinning at me and he said, "Come on, it would be a shame if your friend got famous and not you." And we ended up following him to his room because of my friend. I didn't think it was right to just leave her. His room was down this long corridor. How convenient that it was so far from the elevator and stairs. He opened his room and there was a camera on a tripod in the middle of the room in front of the bed. There were toys, mostly girl toys and stuffed animals on the desk next to the bed. At that moment, I thought he was actually telling the truth, but as I was looking around and as I glanced at him, grinning like he just won the jackpot and was gesturing us to get in, I had a really bad feeling. My gut told me to leave right then. I didn't know what a pedophile was then. I didn't even think about him possibly wanting to hurt us or touch us. I just knew that something was off and I listened to my gut. So without saying anything, I grabbed my friend's hand and started to back away, and then I said that my mother is probably worried about us and we should be home now. He didn't say anything. He just stared. We walked back, and you know when you're walking into a dark corridor or somewhere else at night and you feel like something is going to grab you from behind and you get goosebumps? That's exactly how I felt, and so as soon as I heard his steps following behind us, I started running without even warning my friend. Obviously, she started running too, and I slammed the door to the stairs open, and in the corner of my eyes, I could see him coming after us. I literally jumped on the stairs until floor 4 with my friend asking me why I was running and saying that I was freaking her out. He stopped running after us as soon as we reached the stairs. We banged on my apartment's door and slammed it shut behind us right when my mother opened it. We told her everything, what floor he was on, the number of the room, and everything he told us. She called the police, and when they came to have a chat with him, they found the door open with nothing and no one inside. From that day on, I wasn't allowed to play outside or in the corridor anymore, and my mother got super paranoid and overprotective with me. We moved apartments, and then a year later we moved somewhere else. I never seen or heard of that man again. Seriously, everyone, trust your gut. If you feel like you should run and get away from someone, don't think about it twice. God knows what would have happened if we went inside his room. For some context, once a week my parents would go out running with friends and leave my sister and I, me 14, her 10, alone for a few hours. It would be dark, so usually they wore neon clothing. Also, where I lived, it's common for houses to have a 7-foot-plus wall around.
Alright, guys, I am not a boy. I am not the one reading the stories. I am... I'm listening to someone else do it, okay? Stop thinking that I'm a boy. I'm not, I swear. It's not me. It's not. I don't know why you would think it is. That's such a ridiculous thought. Anyway, back to the stories.
Around it. The door to the front yard could be opened from the kitchen by a display where you could see who was ringing the doorbell on a screen. This was a regular night. They'd left in a taxi about 20 minutes to go to get to the meetup point. Since our doorbell was broken, my sister sat in the kitchen to watch the screen. I happened to be in the room when it lit up, showing a man looking at the ground in a neon yellow windbreaker. "Oh, Dad's come home early," I pointed out, a little confused. "Yeah, maybe he hurt himself." My sister walked over, reaching out to the display to open the door when I stopped her. My dad is a fairly tall man, about 6 foot, where this guy obviously looked to be about 5'5". That's not Dad. We both froze. The screen stayed on for a full 3 minutes, showing he was ringing the bell repeatedly. It's supposed to turn off after 30 seconds. He seemed to be getting frustrated and started banging his fists against the door. We could hear him shouting slurs at us, telling us to let him in. Eventually he walked off, throwing his hands in the air as if though he was annoyed. My sister and I stayed huddled in her room until our parents called us 45 minutes later for us to open the door for them. I don't know why we didn't call when we first saw the guy. Shock, maybe? Scared of being in trouble for almost letting him in. But by the time they'd come home, we had calmed down and told them everything. Turns out, my dad had forgotten his windbreaker in the taxi on the way to the meetup point, so it seems the driver had come back, posed as my dad, and tried to get into the house. We haven't been left alone since, and it took me ages before I finally stopped being scared of this man who had our address and somehow knew that my sister and I were still in the house. It still fills me with dread thinking of how long he could have been watching my family in order for this plan to work. In 2006, I was a college student at ASU. I lived in an off-campus apartment on the ground floor, and it was a block off a major street here in Phoenix called Baseline. These details are important. In the summer of 2006, Phoenix, Arizona was plagued by 2 serial killers. One was the Phoenix shooter, who ended up being a team of 2 guys randomly shooting people, and the other was the Baseline killer. Having 2 serial killers put the entire city on edge, and everyone was talking about it. I even saw articles in Time or Newsweek about the situation. So, the fall 2006 semester had just started. Now you may have heard this, but Phoenix is hot in August. It would get stuffy in my apartment, so I'd leave the window cracked a little bit because the morning air is nice. The blinds provided visual cover. One morning, a strange sound woke me up. It was the crack of dawn, 4:45 a.m., and the sun was just barely coming up. The sound was a tapping sound, and it seemed intentional, but I thought it could be a bird or some branches or something trivial. I ignored it, and it went away for a bit. After about 90 seconds of silence, the tapping returned, and it was absolutely purposeful. In my mind, I thought it was my boyfriend, who thought it was cute to try and scare me sometimes. I decided I'd be a bit of a brat and make him wait, but I was also getting really angry. How dare he pull a prank when I'm trying to sleep? This is just like him. I'm going to give him a piece of my mind about disturbing my sleep like this, I thought to myself. The tapping continued. At a certain point, I got up to get a glass of water, still being in the mindset of wanting to annoy my stupid boyfriend who thought it would be funny. I saw some movement through the slit in the blinds, and I marched over and yanked the blind so I could see. Definitely not my boyfriend. I said very loudly, "Jesus Christ, dude!" He sort of seemed taken aback by my anger, but only slightly. The man I saw will be with me forever, or more specifically, his eyes and the feeling they gave me were insanely creepy. Honestly, words can't do justice to how terrifying his eyes were. They looked like black orbs with no white in them, absolutely predatory. When I see pictures of Ted Bundy or Charles Manson, that's exactly what he looked like. Even if you saw a picture of how they looked, it's different when you experience it in person. He was crouched down like an umpire. He had on dark pants, a dark purple shirt, and a dark Nike hat. He had dark skin. I thought he was Hispanic, but I later found out that he was a light-skinned black guy. You'll find out how I learned his name later. Anyways, after I yelled out at him, he whispers me, "Can I talk to you?" If you want to know how insanely creepy that is to hear, just whisper that sentence out loud to yourself right now. It still sends chills down my spine when I think of how that sounded. His hands subtly moved towards his waist. I later learned he would blitz attack his victims, and he probably had a gun. Now, this is about a 3-second interaction at this point. For some reason, I thought of Ted Bundy and how he pretended to be crippled to target his victims. I thought of my mom telling me not to be nice to strangers. Don't be afraid to be angry. My thinking wasn't as calculated as all of that, but it was more than nano-processing of how I was dealing with the situation. So, when he whispered that, I started yelling at him. "God, no, get away from me, douchebag!" I shut the window angrily and locked it. I laid back down and wondered if I'd been too mean. What if he needed help? But then why would he be like tapping and whispering if he was in trouble? He's probably a creep after all. I was too annoyed to go back to sleep, but I sort of laid back down. I told my roommate about an hour later, and she sort of jokingly asked if it could have been the Baseline killer. When she said that, my heart sank. His face looked exactly like it did in the police sketches that were on a billboard everywhere. The only problem is that the billboard showed him with dreads, and the man at my window had no dreads. Apparently, he was some sort of disguise artist who would wear wigs. Updating the police sketch would have been a nice move, but they didn't. I called the Phoenix police, and the detective I talked to agreed that it sounded like his MO. The suspect would say something to throw off his target, and then he'd blitz attack. The detective said that my angry response probably made me seem like too much of a hassle and moved on. The only problem was that I thought the guy looked Hispanic, and the detective said many witnesses described him as black. I thought they might want to come out and try for samples or surveillance video or something, but I didn't hear back from the detective. My parents freaked out, then got us knives, pepper spray, and put up signs. We tried to leave the apartment complex, and we learned another tenant had complained about the exact same thing. I never learned the details, but this idiot was apparently going around the complex trying to find a target. The stupid apartment wouldn't let us out of our lease, so we moved to a second-floor apartment right above our old unit. Side note, the neighbors who moved into our old unit were horrible. Obnoxious tweakers who would do meth and play pitbull on repeat for hours and have knife fights at 11 a.m. on weekdays. There were times I wondered if they might be worse than the actual serial killer who came to my window. So that unit was cursed somehow. And then, on September 4th, 2006, they arrested Mark Godot. I think the detective didn't call me back because they were days away from arresting Godot. When I saw his mugshot, I was sick, but also relieved. He was absolutely the guy outside my window. To me, he looked like he could be Hispanic. You can judge for yourself if you Google it. He's on death row in Arizona now. His wife tried to mount some campaign to show that the police were framing him or something. On a personal level, it certainly would make for an interesting coincidence if the framed innocent guy was also whispering like a creep and tapping on my window. The other cool thing about this story is that I had a really bad eating disorder at the time, and about 8 months after this happened, I got into solid recovery. I never would have experienced how wonderful life could be if the slightest thing would have changed that morning in 2006. I can't think of something more scary than a serial killer tapping on your window. That actually happened to me, and if it happens to you, just scare them right back. Don't be afraid to be downright rude to someone who's injecting themselves into your space. It could save your life if you're not afraid to throw your weight around and tell someone off. I was about 12 or 13 at the time this happened, pretty young. My mom had asked me to run across the street to Sobeys, a grocery store in Canada, and pick her up her favorite ice cream while she popped into the shower. This is normal for us. I'd go out and get it for her all the time. It was legitimately right beside my house. I just had to turn down a very short sidewalk that led to an intersection, and it was on the other side of that intersection. It took me maybe 3 minutes to walk there. When I get to the intersection to cross, there was a gentleman on the opposite side waiting for the walk sign to come on. He was tall, darker skin, and had a stone-cold look on his face. The walk light came on, and we both started crossing. When we were about to pass each other, he made eye contact with me, so I smiled at him. He didn't smile back, just stared at me the whole time he passed me. It made me super uneasy inside, and I don't know why, but I felt compelled to turn around and see if he was still staring at me. He was. The entire time he crossed the road, he stared back at me, not smiling. I quickly turned around and kept walking to the store. Didn't look back. I tried to put it out of my mind and chalked it up to him being a weirdo. When I finished and had walked back to the crosswalk intersection, I noticed the same man was still there. He was sitting on a wooden planter box under a sign for the gas station that was right there. He was staring at me. I felt a chill run through me, but in my naive 13-year-old mind, maybe he was waiting for someone, I thought. I felt uncomfortable enough to not cross the section that would lead me to him. I would still need to cross to that side, but I was going to try and go around it. Anyway, when he noticed this, he immediately got up and waited for the walk sign to turn on so he could cross and get to the other side where I would be. Luckily, I'm a fast walker, so I got to the other side first and decided to jaywalk instead of waiting for the next walk sign. He didn't speed up, but he ended up right behind me on that short little sidewalk that led to my house, give or take a few feet. I was extremely uncomfortable at this point and kind of scared. Here was this big, dark, sinister, unfriendly-looking man who had seemingly been waiting for me, and now he was right behind me. The way that my street is set up is that when you turn onto it, there are 3 visitors' parking spots on each side. I turn onto my street and duck behind a car. I wasn't even sure why, really. I mean, I didn't know for sure he was following me. I just knew I felt uneasy and I trusted my gut. He walked by my street very slowly but never turned his gaze. He was about to be completely out of sight. I got up and started walking down to my house thinking I was in the clear, and that was just me being silly. I'm about the 4th or 5th house in, so it was close. Boy, was I wrong. He must have realized he couldn't see me anywhere else in the street, so the only logical explanation was that I had turned already, so he walked back. He saw me just as I was getting to my house and then turned down my street. At this point, I was terrified and didn't care if it was my head and I looked silly. I ran. I ran up the steps to the front door of my house, tears racing down my face. I tried to open the door and it was locked. My heart dropped. I didn't bring my key and I had locked the door because I didn't want to leave it unlocked while my mom was showering. I was worried someone would hurt her while I was out. I started pounding on the door, just straight screaming for my mother. I could barely see my door anymore as my eyes were so cloudy with tears. I turned around to check on the man and he was coming up my driveway. I screamed the loudest, blood-curdling scream I could muster, and at that point, my mom opened the door. I pushed her inside and slammed the door and locked it, twice. I was in hysterics and ran to the window to look for the man, who I could now see taking off down the street. I told my mom what had happened and she consoled me. She was supposed to work an overnight that night, but didn't want to leave me alone after that, even though it was just down the street. Nothing really came of it. My mom knew I was spooked and paid special attention for me the next little while, and I always carry a key with me now. Looking back though, the lesson I had learned is that when I smile at strangers, to be ever so careful of who I'm friendly with. I'm an avid hiker. When I can't make the hour-plus long drives up to the mountains, I enjoy the nice hikes near my home. This one particular hike near my home is 5 miles in many different directions, like a Goosebumps book of sorts for hiking. You can only see the trees and the greenery on one hike, or a massive waterfall on another. Follow the river on another, see the abandoned and dilapidated mills from decades ago, etc. I went to the waterfall this time. It was about 2.5 miles in, and I sat and did some work, enjoying the serenity. When I was ready to leave, I looked around and saw a family, father, mother, 3 kids, near me. I packed my things back in my day pack as they left. I am a major people hater. I prefer to hike in areas where there are no people for miles. I chose to go a different way back to the trailhead than the way I'd came because I didn't want to run into this family for the next 2.5 miles. I checked my map on my cell phone and found a route that I could take back that seemed remote enough. I immediately noticed that this trail was not man-made, but just probably what was left after some flooding. It was going upriver away from the waterfall, and I was so close to the river, all I had to do was walk out onto a bent tree and I could touch the water. It was a very small, thin trail, not big enough for people to walk side by side, and was covered in thick roots. I enjoyed this. It was peaceful. I passed some girls who had hooked up hammocks to read in about 20 feet to my right after I hiked this little path for a while, and I had nothing but the sound of the slow-flowing river to my left, until I heard lots of footsteps coming from behind me. I didn't want to deal with people behind me, so I stepped out onto the tree that hung over the river and waited for them to pass. It was that family from the waterfall. I could have sworn they went the complete opposite direction, but whatever. I waited for a few minutes before I started walking again. I didn't want to run into them. Pretty soon, their voices disappeared into the distance, and I was able to go back to enjoying the peace and beauty around me. I hiked for another 5 or so minutes when I had to turn a sharp corner around a boulder at a major bend in the river. This man, the father, was standing there on the other side, crouched down like he wanted to scare me. I screamed, and he laughed. I got really angry and noticed that his family was nowhere near us. I yelled, "What's the matter with you?" Not bothering to control my anger at being snuck up on by some stupid human. He wouldn't stop laughing. I realized that I was dealing with an idiot or a psychopath, and I didn't want to deal with either, so I turned around and booked it. I could hear him behind me, following. He wasn't a very big man. He stood about 5'6" and was around 180 to 200 pounds, but he was keeping pace at about 20 feet behind me. Let me tell you that this path is not for running. I very nearly went sideways into the river a few times, but this gave me a few ideas too. The routes I could mostly handle. I knew the terrain and the park pretty well. As long as I focused on my quickly placed steps around the thick root system and keeping my balance, I could make it. It was running back towards the waterfall, downriver, where surely there would be people around. It was a straight shot. But then I remembered the hammock girls, and I remembered that they were slightly hidden, and if I picked up the speed, dude behind me would miss me turning because of the natural curves of this path. I sprinted on the trail and burst into the hammock girls' area. I sputtered out a quick and quiet explanation, and they hid me behind the lowest hammock. Took us 5 to 10 seconds max to get set up, and the three of us watched as this guy ran past not too long after I was safely hidden. I stayed with the girls for another few minutes, just to be safe, explaining the situation and catching my breath, and then went back the way I came, upriver. I didn't want to run into this dude again. Oh, you think this is over? No. As I again hiked upriver on this trail, my original remote path back to the trailhead, I tried to calm myself down. I couldn't get my mind to stop thinking I was being followed. I just tried to hurry and get out of there as fast as I could. I turned a sharp right at the boulder that the man was hiding behind before and kept pushing through the rough trail. I tried to focus on the sound of the river that was still to my left, but I couldn't get the sound of my heart out of my ears. Lub-dub, lub-dub, crunch. That's all I could hear. The sound of my pounding heart morphed into the sound of footsteps in an instant. I realized I was being followed again. I looked back, and guess who? The father again. I became even more angry. I stopped and turned around. I yelled at him to stop following me. I screamed bloody murder at him. I yelled profanities at him. I threw a pine cone at him. He smiled a toothy grin and kept walking slowly towards me as it bounced off his shoulder. He wasn't fazed by any of it. He just kept smiling as if I were an old friend. What he did not know is that I am an Army combat veteran and a domestic violence survivor. I have PTSD from both, and I have skills that many don't have. Dude chose the wrong person to mess with that day. I had had enough. I already hate people enough, but this guy was crossing a million lines into I'll mess you up right now territory. So I charged at him. He finally wiped that stupid look off his face. I was seeing red at this point because I will not be made to feel unsafe in the only place I've felt safe since I got a divorce and or went to war. Seriously, screw this dude. I ran directly at him and knocked him down with the full force of my body crashing into him. I screamed at him as I hit him blindly. I grabbed his hair and the waistband of the back of his pants and started dragging him to the edge of the trail. He was the one yelling at me this time. Every time he fought back, I gave him a swift kick. I gave him several explanations for why his behavior was so stupid, and then I unceremoniously kick-pushed him into the river. I told him to cool off in the water and not to come out until I was long gone. I turned back in the direction I had been walking before and decided that I needed to take another detour just to be safe by getting away from him, and also to get away from people. I knew there was a trail parallel-ish to the one that I was on to my right, and I looked around for a clear place to climb up the steep hill, which was mostly granite and moss and ivy. I hadn't planned on impromptu rock climbing that day, but whatever. I found a spot and started climbing until I got scared out of my wits again by 3 guys just sitting in the middle of this hill in a very small, mossy flat spot, smoking. They were completely hidden. Once I caught my breath again, from the shock and the climbing, I asked if they heard me screaming, and they said that they did, but that they thought I had it covered. I rolled my eyes and told them to kick anyone down the hill that tried to follow me, and continued on. Took me a while to cover the 2.5 miles back to the trailhead that day, because I kept looking back, taking detours and hiding randomly. But when I did, I called the cops and alerted the park ranger about the guy. I don't know any other details on that. The cop laughed and said, "Good for you," when I told him what I did. Honestly doubt they did much because I never heard back. I haven't been back to that place since, sadly. Just want to state before I post that I don't agree with any violence, but I wasn't getting out of there without it. I just want to hike in peace, and I would absolutely prefer it if I could do it alone and safely. And also, thank God for those hammock girls. They really had my back that day. To preface, I'll never know what this man's intentions were, but I'm thankful I've listened to my gut anyway, even if it took me a hot minute to smarten up. At the time this happened, I didn't think much of it until looking back on it from the perspective of an adult more mature and wiser. Now, as I revisit the memory of this encounter, I am convinced something more sinister was at play, but I'll never know for sure. I was 17, and as a teenager tend to be a lot less cautious than a young girl of my age ought to be in a new country completely foreign to her. I was on vacation with my family to escape the cold winter weather up north. My parents were very liberal about giving me the breathing room I desired, and I wasted no opportunity to use that to my advantage as much as I was afforded. It was a family resort, and nobody was all that concerned about anything happening. We all had out vacation blinders on, so to speak. Every night, after the sun went down, I liked to wander off to the pool to swim and soak in the hot tub while my parents stayed in their rooms. When you're basking in the lap of luxury at a high-end resort, you don't think about the potential for danger. In hindsight, I suppose this is why tourists are considered ideal targets for predatory activity. Being on vacation made me more sociable and additionally more trusting than I normally would be. I admit that the false security that came from being within the illusory security of this protected resort caused me to lower my guard substantially. The fact that I had already been going to and from the pool area by myself every night with no incident thus far only heightened my cavalier nonchalance. While my parents gave me the breathing room to enjoy my independence, I was here to make friends and have a good time. I didn't care about much else. So just like any other night during my stay, I was lounging in the hot tub, chattering amongst the guests, all my worries completely forgotten for the moment. I was getting a lot of attention because it was apparent I was Canadian, and all the guests amongst me were apparently fascinated by that. I was barraged with questions, some of which I could not decipher whether they were genuine or trolling. Yes, we do have heat and electricity up north. I kid you not, I was actually asked this. Amongst this group of people, I was particularly invested in this conversation I was having with a much older man who came off as nothing but warm and friendly. He claimed he too was on vacation with his family, but they were nowhere to be seen. In fact, he, not including myself of course, were the only ones who had seemed to not know anyone there. Everyone else were with their families. I figured that was normal enough, however, because I too was vacationing with my family, and they were nowhere in sight either. What strikes me as more odd, however, is how he seemed to be engaging only me in conversation and ignoring everyone else. He was also nearly 3 times my age. Doesn't help matters. As the night progressed, people began retreating to their rooms, leaving just me, this man, and a few others. It was around this time that he shared with me what room he was staying at before asking innocently where I was staying. I foolishly told him, but only the sectional area. Although he asked which room specifically, I had enough sense to not divulge that much. Things didn't take a particularly unsettling turn until I began to notice how eerily quiet things had become. There were still some people around, but it was just me and him in the hot tub now. I took this as my cue to start heading back. Bidding him goodbye, I got up to leave, but he instantly stopped me. He insisted that he walk me back to my room, as it's not safe for a pretty little thing like me to be wandering around the resort by myself at this late hour of the night. I took this for concern, akin to a protective uncle, but waved off the supposed hospitality, insisting I would be all right. He became more persistent, switching from concerned guardian to fear-mongerer. He told me how bad things happened to young girls like me without escort, as he droned on about the dangers that might surely befall me as a young female on vacation with no parents around to guard me, a small and defenseless young girl. I felt the first wave of unease wash over me. I shook it off and smiled warmly, telling him thank you, but that I would manage fine on my own. He seemed to deflate as his expression became more exacerbated. At least let me walk you part of the way there until I know you're safe. This puzzled me. If there were predators lurking, how would I be any safer walking from the halfway point than from where I was now, besides it being a shorter trek? Nevertheless, His show of concern was beginning to wear me down. He had gotten me thinking about how dark it now was and the vulnerable position I was in. He was right. I practically had a target on my back. Okay, I nodded after a moment of hesitation. I was young and naive and thought it'd be an advantage to have someone bigger and stronger walk with me. I know. I was incredibly foolish and a sheltered teenager with far too much faith in humanity as a whole. Very unlike the cynical and distrustful woman I am now who always follows her gut. I also, as annoyingly typical as this sounds, did not want to be rude. Fortunately, I have since grown out of my people-pleasing complex and will not hesitate to say no when I feel uncomfortable at the first sign of a red flag, but I had yet to develop this quality then. I hesitantly relented. At the moment, my fear of coming off as rude to an adult overrode that of any subconscious or otherwise concern I had for my safety. His eyes lit up and he nodded approvingly. Good, let's get going then. It's late and your parents will worry. I ignored the twisting in my gut and rose from the hot tub, shivering from the sudden exposure of the cold air. Suddenly feeling too exposed, I hastily fastened my towel around myself and padded towards the lockers. At this point, I was just determined to get back to the safety and warmth of my hotel room. It was only as I was getting closer to leaving that I began to get this sinking feeling in my stomach that something about this whole night just wasn't right. My suspicions were further affirmed as I took note of my escort following me. The lockers were outside, and the woman's changing room to the left of them. I was going to retrieve my clothes from the locker, change in the locker room, and then go, with this complete stranger who I didn't know at all. I noticed he was standing a little too closely now, and I instinctively shrunk away from him. This definitely wasn't right. But it wasn't until I was shakily pulling my top on over my soaked bikini top, having already decided I would skip the locker room, which regrettably accented my womanly curves a little more than I was comfortable with at the moment, and of which he seemed to notice as well, that I decided I could not wander off with this strange man I hardly knew. Any last bit of false security had waned away the moment I felt his eyes on me, watching me dress, his eyes clearly appraising my body. I shivered again, this time not from the cold. As I pulled on the rest of my clothes, I had already made my decision. You know, I really appreciate you offering to walk me back, but I think I will manage after all. Thank you, though. He grew solemnly quiet, which stirred a growing sense of malaise within me as I began to feel more and more validated in my decision to not go off with this man. Are you sure? He pressed. I would hate for anything to happen to you. I nodded more insistently and forced a smile. No, it's all right. I'll be fine. Thank you. Okay, he said quietly as I practically started running for the exit, while still in earshot behind me I heard him say, You be careful now. You never know who might be out there. As soon as I was out of his sight, I began bolting and was stopped in my tracks instantly by the second wave of impending dread to hit me that night. I decided against walking back on foot and headed towards the on-resort shuttle instead. On the way, on 2 separate occasions within the space of no more than 10 minutes, 2 older men in their 50s made a pass at me, and at the shuttle stop, a group of men in a car offered to give me a ride, but I ended up making it back safely from the shuttle without any further incident. Later, I wrote it off as paranoia and convinced myself that he really was just a hospitable older man with a young girl's best interest at heart. But now that I know from personal experience how the men that seem the nicest with seemingly good intentions often are the worst predators, I am convinced I made the right decision that night. I was out of town yesterday with a friend and ended up getting in much later than usual. I was sunburnt and tired, so I guess I wasn't paying as much attention as I normally do, and I had my music playing very loudly in my headphones. It was around 10 p.m., and I got off my train and took my regular walk home. Nothing too poorly lit, but all of a sudden I saw a shadow of someone walking very slowly right behind me, possibly just someone wanting to pass me. So I instantly turned down my music to silent and slowed down my walk drastically. A man ducked around me and passed by. He walked in front of me for a bit, and I thought maybe I was just paranoid, but he slowed down and started walking very, very slowly, looking over his shoulder every few steps to see where I was. I stopped and let him just walk for a bit, and when he was over a block away, I started walking again. Then I watched him duck into a park and hide behind the swing set, staring straight at me. So I crossed the street and beelined towards a better lit street and tried to call a friend. No pickup. Called another. No pickup. Up ahead, I can hear a loud party raging at the church and aim for that. I turn around and he's right behind me again. So I walk out into the middle of the well-lit street and just stand under a streetlight, shining my flashlight app on him as he walked by. He repeated the looking back and walking slowly behavior until I made it to the church. I stood out front and leaned against a car, waiting for him to go. He turned into an alley that goes behind the houses on my street. He literally stood behind the bush, right up against the wall, and stared at me. I stared right back until he ducked into the alley fully out of sight. Around then, wedding guests came out and started talking to me, and shortly after, my friend called me back. She talked to me until I got home as I narrated where I am and gave her a description of the guy in case anything happened, and I got in all right. However, when I saw him duck into the alley, I realized that I've seen him before, dozens of times. I've seen him regularly on my walks home from work. I've often seen him walking near me, shortly ahead of or shortly behind me. I see him duck into the alley and often see him pop out into his property as I walk by on the main street, since the shortcut saves no time. But it's always daytime, and he's never really jumped out at me before last night, as the walk is always a busy one after work hours. This man definitely knows where I live. He knows my work schedule and knows my habits. He may have been watching me for weeks to months now, and I only registered him just last night. Luckily, I'm moving very soon, but it's time to change my transit habits and never go out at night without anyone knowing where I am until then. Any other tips of what to change up or do are highly welcomed. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to check out my Choose Your Own Path horror game on the iOS and Android App Store, and grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon. Links in the description. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon. My high school held an annual Euro tour, and I went on my first one in 2011 when I was 16. There would be a bunch of teachers and parents that came along to supervise, including our headmaster, and almost everything was scheduled, and we did get a few hours every day to explore the cities ourselves. The tour was 12 days long. This would be my first experience on a plane, and my first experience overseas as well. My friend and I were casually walking the streets of Rome, not too far from a hotel, taking pictures and whatnot, wasting time before we had to meet our entire group of around 15 kids and 4 teachers for pizza at a small restaurant also very close to our hotel. This comes into play with what happened later at that restaurant. Fast forward, we are at this restaurant now, all sitting on the sidewalk eating pizza and chatting. The teachers were sitting inside the restaurant right near the door to keep an eye on what was happening outside. I decided to go next to the door to buy myself a bottle of water. I didn't think to take anyone with, as the tiny corner store was so close to the pizza place that a few kids were sitting near the entrance. After leaving the store, I got pushed up against a light post by a large man in a dark jacket. He towered over me, opened his jacket to cover me, and asked me my name. I was in such shock, I couldn't even respond, so he asked me again, and I refused to tell him. Luckily, one of the girls saw this happening, ran over and grabbed me out of this man's reach. I immediately burst out crying, and we alerted the teachers. Our headmaster, thinking he may have been drunk, shouted at him to leave, and the man disappeared around the corner. All was well, things calmed down. I was now standing against the wall with 6 people in front of me, closer to the entrance. The same man then pops out of what seems like nowhere and tries to break through the people in front of me to grab me again. This causes huge havoc with everyone around us, and now all adults are on high alert and getting involved, trying to chase this man away, only to see him run a little further down the road and hop into a white car and drive off. We got the entire group together again and were escorted back to the hotel, very confused by the situation. Later that evening, we got our free time where we got to pick our own restaurant in the area to go with your group of friends. We're normally in groups of 5. We dressed up, walked down the streets until we found a restaurant we liked. The earlier incident had lost its worry with all the excitement and activities that were going on. We were heavily distracted. We all then, the whole tour group minus adults, decided to meet up at a bar, since Euro tours can't be complete without the older group trying to act a little naughty, slipping in a few irresponsible drinks before curfew. As I got to the entrance, I was pulled inside by 2 of the people on my tour and told to sit down. Apparently someone spotted the same man from earlier on in the day in the same white car sitting parked a little further down the dark road. This time he was with another man. I broke down and we were all terrified. We explained what was going on to the owners as best we could and decided to head back out to the hotel as a group, constantly checking around us and keeping count of every person. Luckily, we were leaving for a different town not many hours away very early the next morning. This experience still haunts me. I don't know where this man first saw me or what his intentions were. He may have been following me the whole day, through the night, knowing exactly what hotel I was staying in and everything. Being from South Africa, Europe was another world to me, and we had this idea that everything was safe and free compared to our country. Now looking back, I wish I didn't let my guard down so far. I was raised in a fairly strict but loving Christian household in the Bible Belt. My parents weren't all that unreasonable in their rules and were well-intentioned, but I broke a few along the way like most teenagers do. The summer before I started college, I began a relationship with a slightly older guy. I knew him from high school, and he was attending the college I would soon be at. Johnny was a catch. He was exceptionally handsome, he had been on the football team, and was on a full academic scholarship. Funny, talented, and very personable, there was little to not like about him. We bonded over teetotalism and the love of pranking. The best part, he had his own apartment at the college, which was a 4-hour drive from my parents' house. I could easily sneak up there under the guise of visiting one of my other friends or spending the night at a local girlfriend's house. My parents didn't even know I had a boyfriend. Now, I had just turned 18 and was enjoying my rebellious streak and newfound freedom, but I still happily lived under my parents' guidance and rules for a large part. They always encouraged me to be a free thinker and to ultimately figure out my own morals and values, and I ended up much like them, because they're honestly that awesome. My mom wisely encouraged me not to just sleep with anyone, and it was something I actually held to quite strongly. So while I had no qualms having sleepovers with my boyfriend, I was intent on not having sex with him. He took it pretty well and seemed to respect my decision. One week, smack dab in the middle of summer, I had 3 days off in a row at work. A drive up to see Johnny was in order, and I began my travel early in the morning. He was excited to see me, and we had a great day. Nerf gun wars, reading Stephen King, making out. We went out for dinner and returned for a night of shenanigans, or so I thought. Upon entering his apartment, Johnny produced a box of condoms. He tried this before, so I wasn't fazed and adamantly told him it wasn't happening. The events that unfolded following this seemingly unimportant interaction still haunt me to this day. Johnny's smile disappeared and his eyes went cold, hauntingly cold. I was sitting at his dining room table with my back against the wall. He was standing at the other end of the small table. "You make me sick. I'm sick of you. You play me and all you do is play me." We were serial pranksters and sarcastic in every sense of the word. While his countenance made my skin crawl, I knew he was joking. I had known Johnny for years after all. "I've thought about this for a long time, and you're dead. I'm not doing this anymore. You make me so sick. I hate you and you're dead." I was unnervingly calm, and his voice betrayed a slight hint of anger I've never heard before. I noticed him clenching his fists, popped out veins tracing up his arms. For the first time in our entire relationship, I felt unsafe with him. He held my gaze, unblinking. His second-floor apartment was on campus. It was summer. I had seen nobody else in the building, no other cars in the parking lot. Even if I could get past him, which I couldn't, my two options were unlocking the balcony door and jumping, or racing 15 feet down the hallway to the dead-bolted front door, which opened inwardly, and getting down a flight of stairs. Either scenario led to an empty parking lot. I would have to get to my car or run into the woods nearby. While athletic, I had no chance against him physically. I focused on him. Half of me just knew he was kidding. He had to be. He would break into laughter any second now, and we would return to our beautiful day. He continued talking. I can't repeat what he said. It was too graphic and specific to our location to write out. He detailed everything he had in store for me. If I survived, I would be strangled in the nearby woods, then carted off and dumped at a secluded spot we had explored together. He motioned to some bags he had on his counter. "That's where your body will be within an hour." I had enough. His plan was too well thought out to be impromptu. I'm small, but I'm stubborn and would fight to the death if I had to. I also have a wicked straight face when I need to. It was my turn to hold his gaze with all the ferocity I could muster. I stood up and said the first thing that came to my mind. I'm still proud of the unflinching calm I presented. Inside, I was begging God not to let me die. "You're real funny. I almost believed you for a second. Wouldn't have worked anyways, because what I was going to tell you before all that happened is my dad asked me to come home tonight. He needs help first thing in the morning with the garden for Mom's birthday because Kyle, my brother, hurt his back, and I told him I'd call him as soon as I was on the road within a half an hour." It was a lie, and a not particularly good one, but the delivery was convincing. I dangled my phone in his face and told him he could explain to my dad why I wasn't coming home tonight if he wanted me to stay. Johnny's mouth was agape as he stared at me. I was just kidding," he mumbled, fists still clenched. "See ya," I chirped, pushing past him. My gamble paid off. I grabbed my purse and shuffled down the hallway. I could feel his eyes burning through me, and the electric energy in the room as I internally screamed at myself to move slowly. The deadbolt disengaged, I walked out and fought every urge to run down the stairs. I was too far from my car if he chased me to beat him, and I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me scared. I walked the entire length of the car park. I've always had a bad habit of parking as far out as possible, next to the woods he told me he would murder me in. I knew he was watching me the entire time. I could feel his eyes follow my every movement. As I drove out past his apartment, I saw his shadow in the balcony window. I waved, and he stared. I drove a few miles to the nearest Walmart. It was only 8 and the sun was just starting to set. People milled through the parking lot, blissfully unaware of what I'd just gone through. I collapsed onto my steering wheel and broke down, bawling my eyes out. Then I drove the 4 hours back home. Stupidly, I didn't know how to process what happened and banished it to the recesses of my mind. I spent the next few years avoiding Johnny. The few times I did think about it, I blamed myself for being so naive. I finally told my mom 4 years after the fact and was able to process through it. When I was 17, I got involved with someone who was abusive. Now you have to understand, he was incredibly charming, charismatic, and good-looking. I was this little ugly loser girl who had never had a real relationship, many friends, and was often bullied. Anytime anyone good-looking was nice to me, it was always a setup, but not with him. Yeah, I fell hard. Things started out great. Andrew was very kind to me, said all the right things at the right time. He wanted to join the military, and sad as I was, I encouraged him because it's what he wanted. Things started to worsen when his mother's breakdown started. She was a paranoid schizophrenic, and Andrew would call me while she was having episodes, saying there were FBI agents in her trash cans coming for her. My family took him in, but being that he was under 18 as well, we couldn't legally keep him when his mother came to get him. I know his mother was sick, and we tried to help any way we could. But I soon learned how Andrew treated her. He talked to her so nasty, so berating. He would tell her when to shut up and controlled the conversation. It was almost like she was afraid of him. Red flags started popping up, but I was young and stupid. He slowly started wiggling between my friends. He would cut them off and always want me around him. He hated my male friends for no other reason than that they were male. Eventually he required my passwords to sites, saying that I would give him the passwords if I had nothing to hide. Again, stupid, but I did. He would routinely go through and delete my friends on Facebook, delete messages, and keep a constant watch on me. He started pressuring me for sex. I didn't want to at the time, but I didn't want to lose him. I didn't enjoy it, but it made him happy, so it was worth it in my mind. He really started having me under his thumb then. He told me what I could and couldn't wear, who I could and couldn't talk to. I actually had to tie the straps on my tank top to avoid showing any cleavage. I wasn't allowed to talk to other guys, not even look at them without being questioned. I wasn't allowed to wear high heels in public. No skirts, dresses. He even had to approve my Halloween costumes. My 18th birthday rolled around, and it only got worse. The fights were worse. The control was worse. He started pressuring me for marriage and children. I was not ready to be a bride, and certainly not a mother. I still to this day have no desire for children. But on he would push, and I had to keep pushing back. Eventually, though I gave him everything, he still cheated on me. He either cheated, or the girl never even existed. He was no stranger to making up fake people. I found someone I borrowed his laptop one day, and found he hacked into my art site profile and changed stuff around. Of course he lied about it, but his facts weren't adding up at all, and the evidence was there. I was a dumb kid, but not that dumb. It crushed me. I was an absolute wreck, but little dumb me stayed with him still. I even moved in with him and his mother to try and rebuild our relationship, and because I was going through rough patches with my own parents. This got much, much worse. He failed the psych test for the military. He would go into episodes of psychosis where he would cry and claim people were outside of his window coming to get him. I didn't know how to handle any of this. I was a kid. He would cry almost every day. He would fight constantly. He even tried cutting me off from my family. I put my foot down with that one. During the fights, he started threatening violence against me and my few belongings. He hated my dog, hated my art, hated my sister, threatened to burn them and make me watch so I would hurt. By this point, I was terrified of him. Anytime I wanted to call my mom, he would grab my arm so hard it would leave a handprint bruise until I would drop the phone. I started to grow numb. He would refuse me food because he wanted me thinner. He would lie about everything, even things that made no sense that he didn't have to lie about. I didn't even know if I really knew him. At 19, we got engaged. I really, really did not want to marry him. I was terrified of him, of what he would do if I said no. I was in too deep now. I thought I had no way out. He kept pushing to get married as soon as possible, but I fought back on it. I was still in high school after all. Yeah, late to graduate at 19. One morning, I woke up and found him at the table face down in his own vomit. I tried to wake him, eventually succeeding, but he was very slow and unable to speak or comprehend anything. I cleaned him up. He kept vomiting. I woke up his mother, who seemed more annoyed than anything. She didn't take him to the hospital, but instead left him there alone while she insisted on taking me to school. His mother never liked me much. He later claimed no memory of the event, and that was just a normal night. To this day, I think he probably took some kind of pills, though he would never tell the truth about anything. I got a job while in school to support myself a little. His mother complained that I was just a money sink and burden, though I didn't eat any of their food and took short showers. The only time I would have food for the day was during lunch in high school. I worked fast food most days until 11 at night. Then it happened. We got a call that he had been in a motorcycle accident and had to be airlifted to a trauma center. I'm not proud of it, but for a moment, I thought of how much better my life would be if he'd died. He didn't. Andrew shattered both wrists and arms and broke his femur in 3 places. He couldn't walk, couldn't feed himself. After surgery, when he was released back home, his mother had me tend to all his care. I would wake up at 7 a.m. for school, go to work until 11 p.m., and take care of Andrew all night. He would sleep during the day and keep the light on and TV loud at night because being in the dark depressed him. I've always had trouble sleeping with any kind of light. He would wake me up anywhere from 7 to 14 times a night to get him food, water, medicine, rotate him, bathe him, etc. This went on for 2 months. I started falling asleep in class. It was the only place I had any peace. One day, I couldn't keep awake no matter how much my teacher scolded me, and she yelled at me to get out of her class. She came out and talked to me, and I just broke down crying. I'm so thankful I had my teacher. She was really my best friend. She was harsh and no bullcrap, but she was always there for me and really cared about all her students. I just unloaded everything. She comforted me as best she could and had me go home to get some sleep for the day. Shortly after, my sister moved back home. I've always been really close with my sister. She was bringing me for a visit with my parents, one of the rare times he wasn't with me. She just asked one question. I remember it well. "Are you happy with him?" Again, I broke down. I rarely cry, but I had been breaking. We must have sat in that car for 3 hours, just me spewing my story. My family loathed Andrew. They could see I was afraid of him. My mental health was dwindling. I even planned and attempted to end my life with him because I thought it was my only escape. My sister just held me for a while and agreed to help me move out subtly. And so I did. I had moved all my stuff to her car on the breakup day. He noticed as I was leaving what was happening. He screamed and pleaded and cried. I just gave him back his ring and left him screaming. On the driveway, I shed no tears, not one. I felt like for the first time in now almost 3 years, I could breathe again. For weeks after, he would call me and just cry on the phone. I started to ignore him. Fast forward a year and a half later, I had broken up with my boyfriend at the time, and Andrew began to message me again. He now had a kid and was wanting to hang with me sometime. I'd grown much more backbone since we last interacted. I wanted to tell him how he destroyed my life, what I thought of him, so I agreed. We met up, and sure enough, I laid it on thick. He just laughed and said I had gotten mean. I wasn't mean. I was honest. Later he said he had to pick something up from his old apartment before they threw his stuff out. Reluctantly, I went with him since I had no way home from this point. Once we got there, he convinced me to come up and see his old place. It'd only take a minute. Red flags went off and I started feeling afraid of him again. He wouldn't let up, so I got out of the car and walked with him. I made sure to subtly grab my pepper spray and keep my distance. But by the grace of God, the landlord had changed the locks that day, so we couldn't get in. I still fear what might have happened if he'd gotten me in there, and I know I was really stupid. He tried for a while and got really angry, but just decided to take me home. I was finally home and away from him. He stopped contacting me at all, and I was so happy about that. He would come by my house and tell me to meet him outside for mail. I would just tell him to leave it on the porch and go. I would only get the mail he left hours later. He'd drive by my house sometimes. My whole family was afraid he would try something. Though one day he up and moved to California out of nowhere. I've not seen or heard from him since. I don't even know if he's still alive. I'm 23 now, and still in the back of my mind, he haunts me. I still fear, what if he found me now, and I hope my current boyfriend never meets him. If he ever comes back to my state, I'll rest much more uneasy. I was 10 years old when this happened to me. I lived in a very nice neighborhood called River Plantation. We had a golf course, clubhouse, and Olympic-sized pool where me and every other kid spent most of our summer at. We also had our own phone book for our community that listed names of parents and the children living in the household. One summer day, me and my sitter were swimming at the pool when I decided I needed a break from the heat. She drove us back to my house. As soon as I walk through the door, I hear the phone ringing. I answer, and it's a man claiming to be my doctor. He says that I have an appointment with him that day. He asks me some strange questions, but of course I answer not knowing any better. He asks if I'm developing yet, and I say no. He asks if I have been home all day, and I explain that I've been swimming at the clubhouse. He then asks if I'm wearing a swimsuit, and I say yes. And here's the creepy part. He asks me if I'm wet, and I remember pausing for a second, thinking what a dumb question that was, and I say yes. The man gets quiet for a minute. He tells me that he is supposed to pick me up for my appointment, but that if I wanted to have more time to swim, that he could pick me up at the pool at 3 p.m. in a blue car. So I agree to be waiting for him at 3. I remember being kinda irritated that he was cutting into my swim time that day. After I hung up, I tell my sitter about the phone call. She looked horrified. I knew something wasn't right at that point. We go back to the pool, but don't go inside. Within 10 minutes, 2 unmarked cars pull up. Police officers. She speaks to them briefly, then we go inside the clubhouse. At about 3:30, one of the officers comes inside and pulls my sitter away from the table she was sitting at to tell her of the arrest. To this day, I don't know if the guy was charged with anything or not. I hope he was, though. I was 9 years old when this happened. I grew up in a Southeast Asian country where kidnapping and human trafficking were common. My parents always told me and my siblings never to speak to strangers or go with anyone we didn't know. I was the oldest child, so my parents trusted me to always know the right thing to do and to protect my siblings. My family and I were on vacation with my aunt and uncle. We stopped at a shopping mall. My siblings, who were 5 and 6 years old, wanted to play at McDonald's Playland. So my parents told me to supervise my siblings while the adults went shopping. For some reason, they felt okay with leaving me in charge even though I was only 9 years old. Also, the shopping mall was in an upscale neighborhood and they felt it was safe. I sat at a table near the playland and watched my siblings. I noticed the manager looking at me. He was in his 20s. 10 minutes later, the manager sat down across from me and started talking to me. "Where are your parents?" he asked. "They went to a store. They will be right back," I replied. "You're pretty. How old are you?" I felt uncomfortable, but I replied, "Oh, thank you. I'm 9. The man didn't touch me, but he visually examined me. "You're here by yourself?" he asked. "No, my sister and brother are playing over there. My parents will be right back." The man continued to ask me questions, and I politely answered while repeating that my parents were coming back soon. I really wished for them to come back and rescue me. The man said, "Hey, do you want to go back to the back room? I have cool things to show you." I told him no because my parents always told me not to follow strangers. The man insisted. "Come on, let's go. It won't be long. Just come with me." Again, I said no, and he says, "Let's just try to scare your parents as a joke. Let's go to the back room." I kept saying no and desperately scanned the restaurant for my parents. Finally, the man gave up and left. I was only a young girl, but I understood what could have happened if I had followed. I could have been kidnapped, murdered, or worse. I could have been trafficked and not seen again. Also, I was upset with my parents for leaving their kids behind without adult supervision. I never told anyone about this incident, not even my parents. It bothered me to think of what could have happened. This happened in the early 2000s when I was around 9 to 10. A large majority of my family decided to visit one of my elderly aunts in Waco, Texas. She lived in a bad part of town, but due to how my family was, it didn't bother any of us. It was about 11 p.m. and everyone was in the living room singing along to the music on the television, lounging around on blanket pallets and pajamas and enjoying each other's company. When I say the living room was full is an understatement. We were practically on top of each other, but it didn't spoil our fun. What did spoil our fun was the front door opening slowly. Everyone immediately went silent because 1, we were not expecting anyone, and 2, the only other person with the key to my aunt's house was her son, who was in another state on business. What I now know as the barrel of a rifle began coming through the door with the person peering around. As soon as I saw the person's eyes, they immediately yanked the gun back and said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I have the wrong house. I'm looking for a friend." Closed the door and took off. Nobody moved, blinked, or exhaled for at least 1 minute. At the time, I didn't know how close my family came to death. As soon as everyone came to their senses, my elderly aunt made record time locking and bolting her door. No one slept easy that night. My aunt never moved out of that house or neighborhood despite her son begging and even offering to move her in with him. She says, "I'm not letting some wannabe gangster scaring me out of my house." I wish I had the balls she did. I left the West Coast to go to a college in Missouri. In my second year, I started dating a guy who was in the police academy. When he graduated, he ended up being a guard for the South Center Correctional Prison. He was older than me by almost 10 years, and early on I saw a red flag, which I sadly ignored. Red flags like how he got a 16-year-old pregnant the previous year and had a son that he never wanted me to meet, and another flag whenever he would start bar fights if I talked to any other guys. Before I went home for Thanksgiving, he bought me a golden lab puppy who I named Roxy. He kept the dog while I flew home. My parents and I decided that I was going to move back to California and finish college there because the small Midwest was not my scene. Too many of my sorority sisters didn't care about getting an education. Rather, they would start dating a guy and lie to them about being on the pill in hopes to trap them into a marriage when they got pregnant. When I told my boyfriend I would be returning home after the end of the year, he was ballistic. I mean really crazed. He would call me non-stop yelling, then crying, and then threatening. He threatened if I didn't come home, he'd kill the puppy. When I returned, I asked where the dog was. He said she got sick and died. Later we went by his parents' house for something, and his mom pulled me into a private room and told me he had run over the puppy with his truck on purpose after our phone call on Thanksgiving. A few weeks later, after final exams, my mom flew down to help me pack up my car and be shipped home. On the last night, my boyfriend came by the hotel for our goodbyes. He tried everything from proposing with an ugly, cheap-looking marriage diamond ring. My response was, "Did you buy this from Walmart?" Where he said, "What does it matter if I did? It wasn't for you anyways," as he threw it in the back seat. I was firm in saying we could try long distance, but I was moving home and done with Missouri. Then he locked the doors to the truck, grabbed my purse, and put it on his side of the driver's seat and proceeded to drive off with me in the car. His home was a 2-hour drive from the hotel in a small trailer park town near Rolla. I pleaded and begged. My phone was blowing up, probably my mom. I said she would call the cops. "And tell them what? She doesn't have my plates or know where I live. Plus, I'm a cop." When we got to his trailer, he locked up my purse in his gun room. It was a rough night and one I've blocked out from my memory, so I wouldn't be able to share with you any details except I remember being naked and tied up. In the morning, untied, he made me breakfast and said he had to go to work. I asked him when I can talk to my mom. I even tried playing the game where I needed to call my mom and tell her the good news that I would be staying here with him. He smiled his creepy small lip smile. He said he would discuss it later and that I wasn't going anywhere. When he left, I quickly got dressed and tried the door. It was locked from the outside. He had put a padlock on both doors to the trailer. There was no one around for miles except his aunt, who also had a trailer on the property. I broke the kitchen window and climbed out. I ran to her trailer and pounded on the door. I didn't know her well other than an occasional wave. I said, "I'm Kevin's girlfriend and I need to use your phone. It's an emergency." I pushed myself in her door because she was going to let me in whether she wanted to or not. I called my dad at home because I couldn't remember my mom's cell number and told him I was okay. Instead of concerns from my parents, I got yelled at that I would miss my plane and made my mother upset that I disappeared to go off with my boyfriend. My parents didn't quite understand the situation I had just gone through. I tried explaining again that I was too scared Kevin might come back early. I asked his aunt to call his mother. She hesitated and then called her saying, "There's a strange girl here who says she needs to talk to you." I explained the situation and that my purse was locked inside. She said to hang tight and keep the drapes shut. The aunt was an old lady and not much of a talker except for the occasional remarks about her Kevin being an angel. When his mother finally arrived, she had my purse. I didn't ask how. My phone, of course, was dead, but luckily I was alive with an escape plan. His mom drove me the 2 hours back to the hotel. She didn't say much, and when she did, it was about her son being special, and he was a sweet boy with good intentions, and something about when he had his eye on something pretty, he usually had to have it. I knew I needed to get out of that state, ASAP. I finally got home. My parents didn't quite understand the fact that I got kidnapped. They aren't logical, loving parents I know others have, but they understand quickly how Kevin was a problem. Luckily, he didn't know where I lived, but he got hold of the house phone number and called nonstop. Both my cell and home phone rang off the hook, and the voicemail box was full. My dad and I went to the police station and filed a restraining order. I started dating someone new and posted on Facebook that we would be going to Disneyland. Last minute, we changed our plans and headed to Tahoe for some skiing at a friend's cabin. That same week, my father got a call from his private Disney club that a man had been asking for me every day, waiting outside the entrance, and it was Kevin. My father told him it was my stalker, and security escorted him off the grounds, and he was put in Disney's blacklist, so I was told. The last I heard about him was from a friend who lived in the same hometown, that Kevin had gotten a 15-year-old pregnant from a New Year's Eve party right after I had left for California, and he ended up marrying her. It scares me to think about what could have been, and how lucky I was enough to escape. In the middle of the night, my mother hears the front door of the house open and close. At first, she figures it's me coming home from college, but as the fog clears a bit, she realizes that I literally have never shown up unannounced in the middle of the night. She assumes something is wrong with me and gets up out of bed to come make sure I'm okay when she hears the intruder.
"Where is she?"
She runs over to my dad and wakes him up, then grabs the phone to dial 911. The intruder bounds up the stairs and stops at the landing, repeating the same phrase over and over again. My dad goes outside to see what is going on, weaponless. Intruder is holding something, but my dad can't tell what it is. He described the look in his eyes as that of an absolute deranged person, devoid of humanity.
"I know you're hiding her here."
The intruder runs away from my dad and heads towards the other end of the hallway, methodically checking each bedroom. My brother's room is the second one he opens, and my brother plays dead, acting like the ordeal hasn't woken him up. One of the dogs sleeps with him, though, and she is freaking out at this screaming stranger. She really was never the same, always way more skittish and wary of strangers. Whether it's the dog barking or my brother not responding, the intruder loses interest and moves on, circling back to my dad at the landing. He has never stopped shouting about this woman he is looking for. At this point, my mother has informed emergency services of what's happening, and my dad is determined to keep the guy occupied until the police can arrive. My dad shuts Mom in their room and blocks his path down the stairs. They finally get a look at what the intruder is holding, because he flings it all at my dad. It's not a weapon, it's their mail. After throwing it all, the intruder goes into a panic and starts shuffling through the pile on the landing, finally finding what he's looking for. A Victoria's Secret catalog with Adriana Lima on the cover. He points to the cover, once again demanding my dad to tell him where he's hiding her.
"I know you're keeping my girlfriend here. Just let her go and we'll leave."
My dad denies knowing anything about Adriana Lima's whereabouts. The intruder is not satisfied, and he demands that my father get on his knees and swear to God that they haven't kidnapped his girlfriend. Once my dad is in the vulnerable position, the intruder pushes him off to the side and jets down the stairs and out the front door. After the police showed up and the adrenaline subsided, my dad realized that he recognized the intruder. It was the brother of one of our neighbors. The guy used to live with them for years and was very reclusive. No one had seen him in a while, but apparently he was back living with them. There's some time gaps here, but I want to wrap things up with some final details. The intruder was eventually caught that night. My dad, ever the schmoozer, got all buddy-buddy with one of the officers and would press him for details as they emerged. The intruder was not on any drugs that the police tested for. Doesn't tell us much, really. My dad also found out later that besides the intruder's sister, Adriana Lima was the only person listed on his inmate contact list, so that must have been a pretty heavy psychosis. When Dad finally got to talk to the sister, she told him he'd spent some time institutionalized and had recently been released into her custody. Finally, the real kicker. Once the guy got out of jail, he was allowed to go right back to living with his sister. I didn't know the last bit until this story was recounted during our camping trip recently. And recently my wife and I decided to move back to my childhood neighborhood, one street over from my folks, so we could get some help with our 1-year-old daughter. I know for a fact that we will always be wary of our neighbor. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in New England, on a nice dead-end street. We know all the neighbors, and there were about a dozen kids around my age that lived nearby, some a couple streets over, but all within biking distance. We played baseball, fished in a creek, raced our bikes, etc. There was an older boy, Adam, that was about 15 when I was 10. He lived across the street, and our mothers were friends. He has a lot of medical conditions, most prominently a heart problem that kept him from going to school full-time. He had tutors and nurses come to the house a few times a week. He couldn't be super active, so our moms would arrange a game night on weekends, and a few of us would go over once a week or so and play at his house. My mom always told me to be nice to him because he couldn't be a normal kid and made him feel included. I liked him growing up, and we got along overall. One afternoon after school, I was looking for something to do before dinner, and I was riding my bike around. No one was around to play with until Adam flagged me down outside his house. He asked if I wanted to play with his new Game Boy. I was really excited because I didn't have one yet and I wanted to play Pokemon so bad. I told him I had to tell my mom I'd be at his house and I would be home for dinner. He told me I could probably just eat at his house, I had before, and his mom would just call my mom. Sweet, I thought. I go inside and no one is home that I could see. He has an older brother and both parents that live there. I asked him to tell his mom to call my mom. She was a worrier and I didn't want to get yelled at. He told me she just ran to the store and wouldn't be long. No red flags at this point. I was in a safe space. We head up to his room and he asked me to get the Game Boy out of the crawl space in his room. It was kind of like storage under the stairs with a latched door. I open the door and he pushes me inside and crams himself in there too. He starts to grab my lack of breasts and tells me he likes me better than the other kids. He kisses me, or tries to, because I'm moving my face away and squirming. I start screaming and he is up against the door, so I can't get out of this tiny room. He has a pair of scissors, I'm assuming they were in his pocket, and he cuts a piece of my hair off, then lets me out of the closet. I bolt out of that house so fast. I'm crying and grab my bike. I'm halfway down the driveway when his mom pulls in and asks me what's wrong. I tell her that her son cut my hair off and I didn't like it. She says he's playing and she's sorry I'm upset. I run home and tell my mom. She tries to calm me down and get the story in full, but I'm too upset and just scream and cry. My dad is home at this point and walks over to talk to Adam's parents. Adam admits he cut my hair and it was all just a joke. My dad tells the family to stay away from his family and the whole situation is bizarre. Things are strained with our families for a long time. My mom still saw his mom when they both gardened in the front yards. They would small talk, but it was never the same, and gossip on both sides came out and neighbors took sides. 3 years later, he went to an arcade the next town over and abducted a 9-year-old girl, cutting her hair and doing other horrendous things to her before someone heard her screams from his SUV when parked in a vacant lot around the corner. He got 7 years in prison and is now an offender. He still lives in that house with his parents, and my parents still live in my childhood home. I've since moved a few towns over. I actually saw him a few weeks ago standing on his lawn on the phone when I went over for dinner. I get a cold, tingly feeling down my spine when I see him. He could have done a lot worse, and I'm thankful I got away that afternoon. A few years ago, I was living in a bit of a rundown apartment complex. The town was a safe, everyone knows everyone type town, but if anything bad was to happen, it was always in my neighborhood. I also used to live alone. I'm a young female for context. One night I was getting off around 1 a.m. from my job at the animal hospital. This is a fairly normal shift for me. I'm driving my tiny compact sedan and I pull into the cul-de-sac that leads to the entrance of my neighborhood. I see a large white suburban SUV parked in the circle. Not unusual, as that's generally where people go if they're meeting someone and don't want to go all the way into the complex. But then it started following me. The windows were tinted so I couldn't see inside, and there's no lights on in the parking lot of the complex. I pull into a spot across the street from my building, assuming and hoping that the SUV would continue to pass. I'm facing another building, the office, no residential buildings on that side of the street. Bad move. The SUV stops his car perpendicular to mine, blocking me in. Crap. I keep the car running with the lights off and get my phone out to call 911. There was no way to get away. I had a brick wall in front of me, cars on either side, and this guy behind me. To get to my building, or anywhere I could scream for help, I would have to pass this car. I have never been this scared before. I was a sitting duck waiting for some faceless monster to emerge from the SUV and attack me. Unfortunately, the combination of the long shift and my car charger recently breaking, my phone was dead. Double crap. Then I heard my dog Tito growl from the back seat. I thank my lucky stars I brought him to work with me today. He was so quiet this whole time I almost forgot I had him with me. For some context, my dog is a pit bull, Dalmatian, Jack Russell mix. He was also feral before I got him. He's small, only 35 pounds, but it's 35 pounds of muscle and extreme territorial behavior. Most people don't realize how small he is until he's right next to them. At this point, the SUV has me blocked in for about 5 minutes. He sits up knowing something is wrong and begins barking, snarling, and attacking the back window. He has an extremely loud and powerful bark. No one has gotten out of the SUV yet, but Tito is chomping at the bit to get his teeth into whoever was inside. At this point, the SUV books it, pulls a hard U-turn and drives past me. It then sits at the entrance where it was before, facing my car. I wait another 5 minutes before the car turns around and drives out of the neighborhood and out of sight. I sprinted to my apartment with Tito in tow and locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I hated that neighborhood. I never felt safe the 2 years I lived there. In hindsight, I should have called the police, but I tried to convince myself it was a misunderstanding. Thankfully, I live somewhere that's actually safe, with my boyfriend and a very large male roommate. And Tito, of course. Hey guys, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed these stories and wish to support the channel further, please consider supporting on Patreon, where for $1 or more a month you'll have early access to all future narrations before they drop on YouTube. And if you'd like to grab some Let's Read merch, check out shop.spreadshirt.com/Let's Read for all the deets. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon. For a limited time only, I'm having a 50% sale on my game, True Horror. The link is down below. When I was 16, my parents and I moved to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and I was soon hired at an Italian restaurant as a busboy. On my very first night, I was busy cleaning tables in the dining area when I was motioned over by a table. At the table were 2 men. I would say that they were both in their late 30s, dressed like fairly typical middle-class guys. Earlier when I would pass by their table, I had noticed that they were sitting very still without conversation and didn't seem very animated. Anyway, I go to their table as requested. The man who motioned me gestured to lean closer to him. I assumed he wanted to ask me to get his server or needed something. So I bent slightly forward, and he asked me this question softly. Have you ever had your initials carved into your forehead? In hindsight, I should have said something snarky like, well, not that I can remember, or does it look like it? But I was too taken aback by such a random and weird question. I know I can be clueless when it comes to social cues or jokes, so I chuckled awkwardly and searched his face for a sign of humor, but all I got was a blank stare. His friend and partner was silent and didn't even look at me. I think I shook my head and walked away, completely baffled. I walked into the kitchen and found the server at that table. I told her what happened and asked what was wrong with those guys. Oh yeah, I don't know, but they're freaking weird. Regardless, I continued my duties and cleaned tables. I tried to avoid that table, but the men remained there for quite a while, just as inanimate as before. I don't even recall them eating anything. Maybe they did when I was working around the restaurant. When I was cleaning a table near them, the same man motioned me over once again. I was torn. I really didn't want to repeat that same experience, but I was afraid to say no to a customer. It was my first night on the job, and I didn't want a customer to complain to my manager saying I ignored them. So I went over to the table again. Again, he wanted me to lean close so he could tell me something. I don't know why I did, and he says, "Have you ever had two men pin you down, grab your throat, and—" But that was it. That's all I gave him. I immediately proceeded to nope right away from those guys. I'm a gay man, but nothing about his propositions seemed hot or sexually suggestive like they wanted to hook up. It felt very wrong to me. I'm not sure if they were really high on something, but the flat, deadbeat tone of his voice and their blank stares really unsettled me. I went immediately to the general manager, who kind of shrugged it off. I worked until 2 a.m., and as ridiculous as it sounds, I had to ask the bartender to just watch me get back to my car safely in the dark parking lot. I tell a lot of people this story, and while it is bizarre and funny when I explain it, I was disturbed by the encounter that evening. It was a pretty bad first impression of Florida. So I went on vacation with my family to attend a family reunion in another state. Now my family is Asian and, when gathered, forms a cluster of about 20 loud Asian people who literally never leave each other's side for the duration of our reunions. We always traveled in herds, and we are always secure in our obnoxious caravans of watchful Vietnamese paranoids. So of all times to encounter a creep, this was the last place I ever expected to feel unsafe. Last night we went to a Chinese buffet that was jam-packed with people, and at one point in the evening I got up to use the bathroom. I had already used the restroom when we first arrived at the restaurant to wash my hands, so even though it was in the very back corner of the buffet, actually down a secluded corridor and around the corner, I knew the main bathroom door was propped open, so I didn't think anything of it. I walked down the corridor to use the restroom and noticed a short but extremely muscular Latino guy sort of hovering in the hallways. I passed him and he began to walk behind me. Again, I thought nothing of it, but as I approached the women's bathroom, I saw that there was no men's bathroom in that corridor, so why was this guy seemingly trailing me? The woman's door was still propped open, however, so, avoiding eye contact, I scuttled in with relief, thinking that that was the end of it. In the span of the second it took me to walk from the open doorway to the very back stall, I knew two things. One, there was no one else in the bathroom. There were only two stalls, and the other one was empty. And two, the man from the hallway had followed me into the bathroom, and just as I shut and locked my stall door, he closed the bathroom door behind him. Now I'm panicking. I stand there behind my stall door and stare at him through the crack in the door. He stands by the sinks quietly staring right back. Then he turns and, I don't know why a public stalled restroom has this, turns the lock on the door. At this point, I back away from the stall because I'm convinced he's going to come underneath it at any moment. I text my oldest cousin, the rest of the kids are under 14, and tell him to get a manager and come to the restroom now because I'm trapped in the bathroom with some man. Then I dial 911. And with the phone sandwiched between my ear and shoulder, I pick up the lid of the toilet bowl to defend myself in case the guy tried to crawl under the stall. Don't judge, I saw it in a movie. The phone starts to ring. At this point, neither the man nor I have said a word. I should have done something like said I was calling 911, but honestly, I was too petrified to even speak, which I'm kicking myself over. I should have started screaming, but I had this subconscious, paralyzing fear that it would propel him into action or something. So I just stand there, holding the toilet lid while watching him through the crack in the door. Suddenly I can hear my cousin outside banging on the door and shouting. He's telling some staff member from the restaurant that the door is locked, and I can hear the jingling of keys. This was a really old, cheap door, like an airplane bathroom door. This is enough to freak the man out because he suddenly turns, unlocks the door, and bolts out of the restaurant. My cousin and I tell the owner of the restaurant, but he honestly doesn't seem to care, and acted like we were hassling him because nothing had really happened. He just waved us off, impatiently saying, I got it. I'm still freaked out by that encounter. It's chilling to think about bad things happening in the middle of the most crowded, loudest restaurant imaginable with your family just a few feet from you. Telling the story now, it seems so improbable that someone wouldn't have come in or wouldn't have heard me, but I was so scared I don't think I could have even screamed. Thank God I brought my phone with me, because everyone texts while they pee. Anyway, the moral of the story is, don't let your guard down. Even in the most public of places, one shut door can turn the most innocuous crowded place into a room of total creepiness and fear. This happened around the time I was probably 11 or 12. My sister was in high school, and I'm the younger brother by 6 years. So my sister is at play practice in her high school. The school is in a not-so-safe city, but it was in a nicer area, so most people weren't too afraid of anything happening. While she's at play practice, my mom and I go to pick her up. We're early, so we stop at a restaurant to eat. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with plays and play practice, but it tends to run into the evening, so it's dark when my mom and I are eating dinner. We were at a window seat, and I could see there was 2 silhouettes outside. I couldn't tell what they were doing, but I knew they were looking inside the restaurant. My mom and I were the only ones inside, and I soon forget about these guys. I didn't think it strange at the time, but I probably should have realized that 2 people hanging out in a parking lot at night without a car was probably not a good sign. We finished up dinner, and I went to wash my hands in the bathroom. I remember that it had foam soap, which was kind of a new thing to me at the time. I was telling my mom as we walked out of the restaurant that I thought the soap was cool. I heard it before I saw it. The same silhouette shouted something at us that sounded like, "Hey!" I don't know why, but it definitely wasn't right. Adrenaline kicked in and the world slowed down. My mom and I both had the same idea and booked it to the car. We made it in record time and were inside. I don't think the doors were even locked at that time. The guys ran up to either side of the car and talked to each other over the top of the car. I couldn't hear what they said, but I saw for sure that one of them had a gun, and my mom swears that the guy on her side had a gun as well. It felt like forever, but they eventually ran off into the darkness. We eventually got our minds back into place and called the police as we left the parking lot. We told the security guard at my sister's private high school, which was very close by, about it, and he had us locked in the gym while a search was performed. Nothing else really came of it, but I don't like thinking about what may have happened if we hadn't gone to the car or if I hadn't been there. I suspect they didn't want to hurt a kid. Attempted carjacking or robbery? That's my theory. But what do you think? This happened around 7 years ago. To this day, I'm left unsettled by it. I was around 21 and working as a pastry chef at a restaurant in a major Tennessee city. At the time, I was just out of college and making pocket change, so I was commuting an hour and a half each way from my parents' home until I could afford to move to the city. I regularly worked until close, which meant I also stayed to clean the kitchen. Generally, I didn't leave the restaurant until well after midnight. It should be mentioned I'm female, about 5'4" and 120 pounds. Working late nights in a major city generally left me on high alert to begin with, walking to my car with my keys between my fingers. On this night, I made it to my car safely and set off towards home. Tennessee is not a heavily developed state outside of Nashville, Memphis, Knoxville, and Chattanooga. There are many rural areas. I was about a half hour from my parents' home when I realized I was desperately low on gas. Exits on I-40 can be pretty far apart, and I was hoping to make it to a well-lit suburban area that I generally stopped at for cheap gas. Judging from my gas gauge, that wasn't going to happen. I resigned myself to pull off at a secluded exit with a singular, poorly kept restaurant/mobile station. There was absolutely no one around. It was poorly lit, and at this point I was simply praying the pumps were still running, as it looked like the building itself was closed. As I pulled into the gas station, I noted there were no other cars, not even a yard car. It was deathly quiet as I fished for my debit card. When I glanced up again, a white pickup was very slowly driving around to where I was. No headlights, and so slowly I barely heard it coming. As I saw it pull forward, I remember there were pumps on both sides of the building, and the exit was on the side the truck was coming from. It was too dark to see the driver, and immediately alarm bells were going off. There was no reason for them to be coming to my side. I decided I would rather risk my car stalling on the side of the interstate and take my chances with AAA than wait to see what this truck wanted at 1 a.m. with no one around for miles. I slammed my Jeep into reverse and sped out of this restaurant gas station, miraculously making it to my preferred pit stop with my car running on fumes. 7 years later, I can't help but think I avoided something horrible. As a bit of background information, I'm a 19-year-old girl who is new to the area I'm living in now. I started working at a restaurant here about 3 weeks ago. I won't name the franchise, but it's your typical chain restaurant that most people have gone to at least once in their lives. Our restaurant is surrounded by hotels as a large airport is nearby. There's also a lot of business and movie theater across the street, so we usually stay pretty busy. However, today being a Wednesday afternoon, we didn't have many customers at all. Since I had no tables, I decided to order some food and chill in the back corner of the restaurant for a while. After eating, I still had no tables, so I decided to take a bathroom break. As I was closing my stall door, I heard someone enter the men's bathroom, which is right next to the ladies' bathroom, and this person started to make weird grunting noises. At first, I thought someone was puking, until I heard banging. Next thing I knew, while I was still sitting on the toilet, someone threw open the door to the women's bathroom and started slamming stall doors. The lock on my stall didn't work well, and slamming the other doors caused my door to crack open, and I had to hold it shut. I peered out the crack between my stall door and saw a man standing by the sinks, just standing there. I, of course, felt incredibly uncomfortable in that moment. If I took my hand off the door, it'd open and my pants were still around my knees. Also, there was no way I was leaving the stall with some random guy waiting out there, so I decided to stay put. The guy just turned on both the sinks and left. I pulled my pants up, washed my hands, and left the bathroom where one of my coworkers was standing and asked if some guy was just in the women's bathroom. I told her he came in and started slamming doors and that it sounded like he did the same thing in the men's bathroom. She went to tell our manager, who honestly seemed to not really care. Apparently, before entering the bathroom, this guy walked in and harassed our pregnant hostess after asking her if she had a lighter, which of course she said no. It wasn't until someone mentioned that I could call corporate and complain if he didn't do anything about a guy entering the bathroom while I was in there did our manager decide to do anything. Luckily, our other manager, who was a big intimidating dude, was there because when they asked the guy to leave, he started screaming F you at everyone and screaming about some abomination. It took both the managers to get him out while me and the hostess stayed in the kitchen, watching through the kitchen doors. We finally saw him walking out of the building and across the street, so we decided it'd be safe to come out. And according to one of our customers, apparently the guy had also been kicked out of the hotel next door. Last year, I was temporarily a host at a restaurant which was not very popular, so we weren't very often busy. One midday shift, I hadn't seen a customer in a while, when this old, short, stocky man came in and asked for a table near a window. I sat him in the section of my friend Maria. Each waiter and waitress had their own 3 to 4 table section of the restaurant, and I went in rotation between sections to keep the number of customers being seated fair. Maria was college age, and this man was easily around 65 or older. My host Stan was close enough to their table to hear the conversation getting weirder by the minute. He kept mentioning that he worked for a towing service. He looked far past retirement age, and kept complimenting her. It was seemingly innocent things like, "You have a pretty smile," or "You're a great waitress," to which she kind of nervously laughed and would say something to the effect of, "Aw, thank you," thinking he was a lonely old man just trying to be nice. But then his compliments got weirder, like, "With a body like that, you must have a boyfriend," or, "I wish my ex looked like you when we met." He actually said both of those things to her. At one point, she felt him try to grab her as she was walking away from him. She got so uncomfortable that she ended up having our male friend Chad finish waiting on the man, giving the excuse that her shift was over, when really she went into the kitchen and literally hid from him until he left. When Chad came to be his waiter, the guy lost any cheerfulness in his face and looked genuinely angry, and I was actually afraid at this point, thinking he might try to prey on me next. I was around the same age as Maria and the only one in the same area of the restaurant as this guy. He didn't. He just quickly finished eating while hardly speaking or looking at Chad and left without saying a word. The guy left a tip of $5 in ones and wrote Maria on each one, front and back, with a pen from his pocket. I assumed trying to make sure Chad didn't think it was for him. Our manager gave Maria permission to avoid this guy anytime he came in because of how he behaved. A few days later, he came in and asked for Maria. Her shift didn't start for over an hour, so I told him I would have to seat him with someone else, and he refused. He insisted on waiting at the table that was meant to be her section, and literally sat down prepared to wait over an hour. I went and got her manager, and he told the man he couldn't let him wait that long for her in that section, but he could sit him with another waiter. The dude left without saying anything. The main phone line for the restaurant was at the host stand, so we could take reservations, etc., and this guy called me the next day asking to talk to Maria. I could tell by his voice it was him, so I played stupid and I said, "Can I ask who's calling?" And he just said, "No, put her on." I got my manager. He picked up the phone saying, "Hi sir, this is the manager, how can I help you?" There was a pause. "She's not here, can I take a message?" I watched his face when he listened to what this guy said, and he looked like he was about to throw up. He hung up on the man without saying a word. He wouldn't tell me what the guy said. It was clearly something disgusting aimed toward Maria. We ended up having to tell this guy she didn't work there anymore so he would quit asking for her. After he was told that, he never came back. I was in my second year of college and my girlfriends and I wanted to hit up a new club that had just opened recently in downtown Toronto, now defunct, called Circa. The only problem was that we went to a school in Etobicoke, which technically is a part of the Greater Toronto Area, but the only way to get there would be to take an hour-long transit ride. Not worth it because our bus from the subway station stopped at 10 p.m., or drive. Monique, Josie, and I enlisted our friend Ashley to drive because she wanted to come, but she hadn't been eating / was feeling sick, so she didn't want to drink. Great, a DD, I thought. We pre-gamed, played drinking games, got into Ashley's car, and rode our way to the club. The club was a lot of fun, until my friends and I noticed Ashley passed out on the ground. Turns out, she had been drinking cranberry and vodkas all night and was completely wasted. We hauled her upstairs to a lounge area to figure out what to do next, when she suddenly runs to the bathroom to throw up. I follow her and notice she is throwing up blood. Freaking out, I navigate her back to the lounge area and try to figure out what to do with my other friends. Ashley absolutely refused to go to a hospital. She was beyond wasted and she didn't have her health card on her, so we decided to get some food into her. We drag her out of the club and head over to a Subway restaurant in Queen, about a block or so away from the club. While we were eating, a group of guys were chatting us up. We asked them what we should do, and they gave us a bunch of hostels to try out. We thank them, they leave, and we try and get Ashley to leave. Not happening. She refuses. She wants to eat her soup first. Groaning, Monique, Josie, and I decided to let her finish it. While we are waiting, this group of Armenian guys come in. They sit in the booths around us, talking to us. One guy in particular is interested in me and kept asking me to have sex with him in the bathroom in the basement. I was obviously creeped out, so I said I didn't think it was a good idea. He asked for my phone number, so I gave him a fake one. He called it and asked why my phone didn't ring. I told him my battery was dead. Ashley was taking her sweet time eating her soup, and all of a sudden I had to pee really bad. I asked Monique to come with me to the bathroom, to which she agreed. As we're getting up, all the guys around us get up to follow us down the stairs. As I get into the washroom, all I see is Monique slam the door behind me and say, "What are you doing?" Apparently the one guy who was interested in me says, "Let me through, baby." She responded with, "I thought you had to go to the bathroom. She can go to the bathroom herself. You can wait." I finish my business, wash my hands, and open the door. Monique grabs my hand, and all of a sudden the guys start forming a circle around us. At this point, we're freaked out, so before they get a chance to really do anything, we shove our way through, practically fly up the stairs, barge into the restaurant, and scream at Ashley and Josie to get up and that we're leaving. The four of us dive into a cab that was conveniently driving near us and tell them to just drive, wherever. Needless to say, I was horrified. Honestly, it was one of the most terrifying moments and nights of my life. I was 18, living several hours from home for school with a bunch of girls I didn't know, and I had just gotten a job at a fast food place. After my initial training, I was put on to midnights as maintenance, basically cleaning and changing garbage, that sort of thing. Everything was going really well for the first couple of weeks. I did my job thoroughly, so the managers pretty much left me to my own devices all night, as I didn't need anyone to check up on me. This turned out to be at my disadvantage. After 2 weeks or so, a man started appearing a few times a week at around 2 a.m. He would just sit in the lobby, at a table around the corner and out of view of the tills. He would watch me very intently and would move seats, so he would always be behind me when I was mopping or doing anything in that area. I didn't think anything of it at the time, just assumed he didn't want to be close to the mop. Now, I was constantly in this area. The bathrooms were in this corner section, and in between the bathrooms was my supply closet. The closet and bathrooms were in a small space slightly cut off from the rest of the section. There wasn't a dividing door, but it was almost an alcove. One night, I went to get some supplies in the closet, and when I turned around, this guy was blocking the exit to the main section of the restaurant with a big grin on his face. I'm 6 feet tall, and at this time, I had long dark blue hair. He was a very skinny black man, a little shorter than me and probably in his late 30s and early 40s. I just sort of stared at him, then asked if he needed any help. He asked me what my shifts were for the week, and then when my days off usually were. I just answered that my schedule wasn't posted yet, and I was always all over the place, hoping he would leave me alone. He said, "That's okay, baby. I'll just wait for you here every night then." And off he went to his table, staring at me. I was a little freaked out, but not as worried as I should have been. He kept his word, too. He was coming in every night around the same time, and he would get angry at me the next night if I hadn't worked the night before. I told my manager, who basically told me he was harmless and to leave the matter be. This was nerve-wracking enough, but at least he just sat at the table and stared at me, occasionally talking to me, but nothing perverted or anything. I wish it had stayed that way. Somehow, he found my exact schedule. I have no idea how he managed it, because my schedule was different from week to week, so it's not like he was following a pattern. He would be there waiting for me when I started, and he would leave about 10 minutes before I was done. I talked to my coworkers, who said he never came in if I wasn't working. At this point, he started bringing 2 friends with him, big burly black men, and whenever they saw me, they would get in a little circle and start talking. The main scary guy would grab my arm as I went past, trying to get me to sit with him, give him my number, all sorts of things. I was terrified of losing my job, so I did nothing. One night, right before exams, he was sitting with his friends in their usual place. When he grabbed my arm, he asked me when I was taking out the garbage tonight, and my stomach dropped. We had a big trash compactor in the very back corner of the parking lot in an enclosure, with 0 lights anywhere around it. It was a spot that was completely cut off from the restaurant. Part of my job was to take all the garbage bags outside myself and put them in the compressor. I was usually outside for upwards of 5 to 10 minutes. All I could think of was how often I had done it, my back to the parking lot with a compactor so loud I'd never hear anyone coming. How easy it would be for someone to just walk up to me and close the doors. My manager never checked up on me. By now, I was going entire shifts without them talking to me. I stammered something and booked it behind the counter, where I ineffectually told the manager. Once again, I was told he was harmless and that he was just being friendly. Thoroughly scared and a little ticked off now, I asked one of my male coworkers to come with me to take the garbage out. I had never asked before, so I told him everything that had happened thus far. He told me to stay inside behind the counter, and he would take them out alone in case they were waiting for me outside. They were. He came back in and told me they had been hiding in the shadows around the compactor's enclosure and had come up behind him as he was tossing the bags inside. The main scary guy apologized and said, "Wrong person, sorry." And then they all left. I was mortified and beyond grateful that my coworker had told me to stay inside. The night manager yelled at me for getting someone else to take the trash out. I begged the non-awful morning manager to let me switch the rest of my week's shifts with a morning person, and then I quit at the end of it. They came in every night looking for me. I had decided to move back home for the summer instead of staying in the same city as those creeps, and on the day I moved back home, I stopped in at my old restaurant. My ex-coworkers told me that they came in every night still, asking about me, and got angry when they found out that I had quit. Apparently, they were coming in at all hours now, hoping to catch me off guard. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to check out my Choose Your Own Path horror game on the iOS and Android App Store, available now for 50% off, and grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon. Links in the description. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon. True Horror is a choose-your-own-path horror audio game and is available on the Apple and Android store. By purchasing the app, you get the full exclusive game with 10 choose-your-own-path horror audio stories. With your support, you can help me turn it into a series. Now enjoy the show. This happened to me about 9 years ago when I was 15. To keep a long story short, it was a weekend, so I didn't have school and my parents allowed me to spend the weekend at a friend's house who lived nearby. It was late on a Saturday when we walked over to a corner store to buy something for my friend's mom. On our way back, we spotted somebody walking up and down the street who we didn't recognize. He was a strange-looking fellow, overweight, wearing a hoodie and jeans. He looked at us as we passed him by and gave me a very odd look, which gave me slight goosebumps. Nevertheless, my friend and I went back to our place and the night continued. My friend and I awoke early the next morning to the sound of sirens and loud noises coming from the street behind us. I looked out the window and saw what nobody would want to awake to, a fire. By this time, my friend's mom had awoken and asked us to come outside with her, which we did. We all walked across the street to a neighbor's house and looked up into the sky at the smoke from the fire. Once the chaos had ended, my friend's mom inquired with a firefighter about what had happened. They didn't know the cause of the fire, but did say that a woman was taken out of the house and to the hospital. She ended up dying the next day. It was an elderly woman who I didn't know, but my friend's mom did. When we learned that an arrest had been made in the connection to the fire, I was eager to see who it was, as was pretty much everyone else in town. When I saw a photo of the man, my jaw figuratively hit the floor. Well, I'll be darned. That was the same man that my friend and I had passed by the night before the arson. I couldn't believe it, and I still can't believe that I saw the perpetrator of a serious crime not long before the crime was committed. This happened to me when I was roughly 4 years old. Not super creepy, but it certainly contributed to my poor mother's fear of men, and consequently the one she instilled in me. When I was a kid, there was a company in my neighborhood that would drive around door to door and sell frozen meals and meat for relatively inexpensive prices. Given the fact that my neighborhood was preoccupied by parents with young children and the elderly, this service was quite popular, and my busy mom was just as much of a fan as the rest of the cul-de-sac. A few alternating people generally circled around weekly, and I remember them decently well, since my twin sister and I were very friendly and rushed to the door any time there was a visitor. There was a very straightforward but kind woman who just wanted to get her job done, a sweet young man who adored our terrier, and a man roughly in his 40s who was generally very outgoing and talkative. Perhaps stereotypically so based on his demographic, This story is centered on the last person. I don't recall this guy's name, nor does it matter for the sake of this story, so I'll just call him Creepy Delivery Guy. Like I previously stated, Creepy Delivery Guy was a friendly guy and outwardly quite normal. A clean-shaven, articulate guy who loved to talk about his daughter for minutes on end, who was about my age. He talked to my sister and I plenty while at the door about her. Even so, my mom still got a weird feeling from him, but dismissed them solely because he hadn't done anything to warrant concern. After a few rounds in our neighborhood, he asked my mother if he could use the restroom in a polite manner because his shift had been quite long. She hesitantly agreed, and he thanked her, then returned after an abnormally long time and gave us our order. After this, the shifts no longer alternated, and it was just Creepy Delivery Guy who delivered in our neighborhood. He requested to use the restroom every single time he delivered, and eventually didn't even bother explaining. Allow me to restate that he took an unusually long time in the bathroom. For my mom, the feelings of discomfort were intensifying, but she was much too polite. The turning point, however, was when, while in our kitchen, Creepy Delivery Guy described to our mother how his daughter had gotten an infection in her private area because she hadn't wiped properly after going to the bathroom and had wiped back to front. He turned towards us and smiled wide, though still talking to my mom, and requested that he could show my sister and I how to wipe properly so it didn't happen to us. My mom said no. What a shock. After that, she didn't answer the door when he came around, and whenever we saw him driving the truck in the neighborhood, Creepy Delivery Guy would glare at us. We later discovered through word of mouth that he was unmarried and didn't have any children. This happened to me about 2.5 years ago. I was 19 at the time. I'm only 5'2.5". Yes, the half-inch matters when you're this short. I'm a female. I had moved to Seattle from a small town in California. My dad had always raised me to be aware of my surroundings and taught me how to defend myself at a young age. I knew if something bad happened, I would at least go down fighting. Seattle is a generally beautiful area depending on what part you're in. It's a big city, so it's an eclectic melting pot of any kind of human you could imagine. Rich, poor, unstable, successful, beautiful, disgusting, rude, kind. Basically any adjective and then antonym for it could describe the kind of people that live there. Gunshots were a frequent noise. Sketchy glances from people with drug-induced sniffles were tossed around daily. There are track marks, like speed bumps in a school lot, on the arms of some hazy-eyed lost souls that wander around bus stops and bars. You couldn't go into a store without seeing someone steal something or attempt to. Someone was always talking to themselves at least 20 feet away from you most of the time if you were in a populated area. Anyone that's from Seattle can tell you that there is a high rate of severely mentally ill people wandering around, filtering in and out of the justice system instead of getting mental help or medication. It was October. Seattle notoriously rains on and off, so a big black hooded jacket in my backpack was always a must. I liked keeping my hoodie up for the general rule of thumb that weirdos don't really mess with other weirdos, but this night was different, and I hadn't brought my normal nighttime creep attire. What I was wearing doesn't mean I deserve to be harassed, but dressing like a creep at night saved me from anyone wanting to interact most of the time, so it was just something I did to be more comfortable and look less approachable. This night I had worn a dress and forgot a jacket, so I looked really put together and friendly. I probably also looked stupid since it was October and didn't have a jacket. My friend had moved into my home to escape an abusive ex from our tiny town. She was just as short as me, and we were often told we looked like sisters. We decided to go downtown for her first adventure since moving in. That was our first mistake. We got downtown at around 10 p.m. thanks to public transportation. That was fine because in Seattle, the bus runs late, so we had a way home. Window shopping wasn't an option because stores had closed. Around 10 p.m. during a weeknight, most sit-in fast food were closing, and it was the end of the month, so we couldn't afford anything but that. I googled where a McDonald's was that was still open on the inside so we could get 2 burgers. It was an hour walk from where we were, so we decided to head off in that direction. As we got further and further towards our destination, the lights became more scarce and the area looked more and more seedy as we passed buildings. My phone went black out of nowhere. I had an iPhone, so it was really not surprising because that piece of crap was always on the fritz. My friend only had a flip phone, so it was useless in terms of directions. We decided to just keep walking and hope we'd find our destination by luck. And that was our second mistake. We walked and walked for what felt like a lifetime, still nowhere to eat. By now, we were in a crappy lit area across the street from a bar. We hear a guy cussing, yelling, and freaking out. People started yelling back at him, telling him to get away from them and go somewhere else. We started laughing because this guy was clearly on drugs or had too much to drink, acting like a total loon. There was power in their numbers because the creep crossed to the other side of the street we were on after being scared off by 10 or more people. Our laughter stopped upon noticing that he was headed in our direction. Our hearts sank, and he yelled, "Hey, slow down, nice legs." Of course, that was enough to make us speed up. "Hey, I'm talking to you guys," bellowed from what I assume was around 10 feet behind us. We start going faster. I opened my knife and held it in the palm of my hand near my side so it was a bit hidden, looked at my friend and told her to dial 911 as we were at a fast-paced jog. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. In that moment, I knew that if anything happened, it would be solely on me to protect us. Everyone has fight or flight, but people forget to mention the third option is freeze. Some people don't take any action at all, and that's their natural reaction to fear. He caught up to us. He tried to grab her arm. I managed to pry him off of her arm by pushing him with all of my might, still holding my pocket knife in the other hand. Staggering backwards from being pushed, he started coming towards us. "Call the cops now," I said, and she didn't. She looked at me like a deer in headlights, and that's when I could feel him behind me. I pushed her away and told her to walk the other way. Instead, she stood behind me, petrified. Fear consumed her ability to move, and she was stuck. He was mumbling, calling us names for ignoring him when he was giving us compliments. That's when he lunged at me. I pulled my knife out into plain sight, not being hidden in my hand. I put it to his red sweater. Side note, if you're wondering what he looked like, he had a peppered, very long, scraggly beard. His lips were chapped and scabbed. He had beady eyes and long dark hair that looked wet. All his clothes were dirty and torn. His scent could gag a maggot. After looking at my knife on him, he spit in my face and cursed at me. I started just stabbing air since there was spit all over my face and my vision wasn't awesome since I had stranger saliva in my eyes. I was just yelling "screw off" as loud as I could to draw attention to myself. My friend was still cowering behind me. He took off, speed walking the other direction back towards the bar as I told her to call the cops. I wiped the spit off my face. She looked at me bewildered and ghost white. I grabbed her phone out of her hands and called. The 911 operator was useless. I told her my location and a description, and she sarcastically asked how they would find him if he walked away, and my description was like a lot of people that frequent downtown. The dispatcher told me I needed to stay there or no one would bother to check out the scene without a witness. That wasn't comforting. I told her I would stay there and wait for an officer. My friend begged me to leave, but all that kept running through my mind was, what if he comes after people that had froze the way she did? What if he came after someone without a knife or anything to defend themselves? I needed to wait for a cop. We hid behind a building, but in sight of traffic. Peeking behind the building, we could see he was pacing up and down the street, looking all around. 20 minutes passed. No cops. I called again. She told me they were on their way. 45 minutes passed. No cops. Called again. We told you they were on their way. 1 hour later, my friend convinced me to leave, otherwise we would miss the last bus. We made it home safely. I cooked dinner. 2.5 hours later, I look at my friend's phone I had left in the living room as I cooked. There was a missed call from the police department. I didn't bother calling back. Something horrible could have happened to us within that time, and no one showed up. Cops drove by us. I even tried to flag one down, but he turned on his lights and started following someone through a stoplight. The man was probably long gone by then, and honestly, the dispatcher's sarcastic tone about my description really made me feel like, yeah, he does look like your run-of-the-mill bum, so who will care enough to find him over this? But to the creep I pulled a knife on, hopefully you will meet a cop that actually does care about putting idiots like you behind bars. Me and my roommate, females, late 20s, best friends, just moved into this apartment, and yesterday was our 1-month anniversary of living there. It's in Ontario, Greater Toronto area. Great neighborhood, a little touristy, not a bad area though. The building is in great shape but old, and many of the tenants have told us they've lived there for 20 plus years. We were assured the locks were changed before we moved in. I have a key, as does my roommate, the old couple that takes care of the building in their 60s and the general maintenance guy. I was the last to leave the apartment around 8 a.m. and I locked the door. My roomie got home at around 4:30 p.m., unlocked the door, changed, and left again to run errands. We both got home again at around 6 p.m. First thing I did was go to the room to change out of work clothes, yoga pants for the win, and I noticed that my closet looked messy. I had a lockbox of knickknacks, notebook, tissue paper, lip gloss, keychain, junk drawer stuff that looked like it had fallen onto the floor of my closet. However, the box was then put back up and some of my dirty clothes from my basket were inside. It looked like someone had rummaged through my dirty laundry and tossed clothes out of their way, which probably caused the box full of stuff to fall in the first place. On top of that, brand new clothes I had just purchased were still hung up but hanging inside the box, like someone was quickly sliding clothes on the clothing bar and it flipped some into the box. Because I'm very neat and tidy, I knew right away that this was not right. I didn't do this. So I began to rationalize. Did Rumi do this? No, why would she do this? She wouldn't do this. If she needed something, she'd ask. Did I do this? Maybe I threw my pants in the closet and it landed in the box. Maybe I did leave this stuff on the floor. Oh well, weird. Anyways, essentially my inner dialogue. Cut to about 9:45 p.m. I'm in my room and all of a sudden I hear Rumi call my name, loudly, in a tone of voice I've never heard before. I go to her room and she said, "I found the gift you left me." I say I don't understand. The present in my pillow? I look at her from the hall and say I have no idea what she's talking about. I go into her room and on her bed is a dildo. My dildo. I grab it and say, "What? That's mine. Why is that in here?" She says, "It was in my pillow. You didn't put that there?" I tell her it was mixed in with my laundry basket. That's where I leave it to remind myself to wash it within a day or so. Now the wheels are turning and things are coming together. Someone must have let themselves into our apartment with a key, went into my room, looked through my dirty laundry, found the sex toy mixed in there, and put it inside her pillow so she'd find it when she went to bed. After being in shock for a few minutes, the reality sunk in, and I started to cry. Someone had access to our apartment for at least the last month. We decided to talk to the building managers, the old couple, and while they seemed to want to comfort me because I was an emotional mess, the husband most likely played it down, saying it was probably a joke, not funny, and asked if we gave a copy of the key to anyone. No, never. I think it was part of their culture or age that made them downplay it. We did call the cops, and they came within an hour or so. They took all of our info and we told them the full story, and they had to look around. Honestly, they couldn't do much, and I figured that, but at least we have a paper trail. I definitely mentioned the handyman as the one they should talk to. They're going to follow up with some residents and the building staff. I also watched the property manager, an old guy, very sweet, and that handyman change my locks this AM. If anything seems out of place, then it's very clear it's either the staff or someone who has access to their apartment and keys. We're getting a camera that we can attach somewhat discreetly, and hopefully it never catches anyone that shouldn't be in our apartment. I was a single mother of 2 young boys. We didn't have a lot of money, so we would often drive down to a small state park along the Oregon Coast Highway. We would park the car and walk a trail through the woods to the beach. We usually had the whole beach and trail to ourselves, with the exception of an occasional surfer. This was almost the case the last time we were there. It was a Wednesday, and we had a good time talking about the trees, berries, and even posing for a few pictures. We rolled up our pant legs and explored the tide pools. It was fun, but we were tired and ready to go home. On the way back, a man came running towards us from another trail. When he stopped, his face was about a foot away from mine. I hadn't seen him as he had first approached, therefore didn't have time to realize I should be scared. I smiled at him and said, Excuse me." As I started walking, it dawned on me. He should have seen us long before he came up on us. He wasn't dressed for a jog either. I started to think of what I would do if he came after us. There was no way to outrun him with my 2 little ones. My kids were talking to me, but I was so scared I couldn't think to answer. So I decided to sing the little song from their Yoshi video game, be careful," over and over, singing faster and faster, trying to make them walk faster. Finally, we returned to the car. I lifted them into the passenger seat through the driver's side. We didn't even need to have seatbelts or a change of clothes. We just had to leave, now. The following Wednesday, I received a phone call from my mom. 2 workers had been shot in the head at that park. One lived. The other, I knew, had not. It turns out that man had been released from prison 2 weeks before. He had stole their pickup. When he was caught, he claimed he didn't shoot them. He described another vehicle that he claimed was there. It was a perfect description of my car. This took place the summer after my freshman year of college, around 2014. I was a cashier at a large Walmart on a busy shopping center street. I knew the area, even though I lived in a small town about 40 minutes away. The drive didn't bother me too much since my mom and I went to this area pretty much every weekend. As a generally polite but soft-spoken 19-year-old female at the time, I happened to ease most coworkers into at least liking me. I'm a personality generally about harmony, and this was before I had completely developed the backbone to stand up for myself. Even now, I'm still working on it. Now, if you think I thought I'd be a target for creepers, the answer was no. I wasn't a cocky thing thinking I could take on the world. I was just a larger girl. Back then, I thought creepers only hit on small, really pretty girls. Yeah, they don't seem to discriminate. I realize being female is enough for some people, and everyone has their own varying definition of someone to like genuinely and someone to creep on. By this point, I had been used to speaking with coworkers of all sorts of walks of life. One man in particular who often flagged me down when I was nearby was this older Jamaican man. At least, I believe that was his accent. The guy must have been in his early 40s. He was thin, not terribly tall, maybe 5'11". He was always smiling and socializing with people whenever he wasn't pushing carts. I, of course, would talk with him on the way in or out of work, or whenever he managed to catch me. Conversations with him always felt a tad awkward with me since I had a difficult time understanding his accent. Truthfully, I wasn't the kind of person to blame him for this. I just generally felt guilty for not understanding him. Though as a few weeks passed, his accent became easier to pinpoint. One day, I come in for a later shift. He walks up with me to the entrance of the store, asking the usual things that are normal for Walmart coworkers. "How are you? When do you get out? Are you going to be working tomorrow?" It was as we were about to part that he handed me a piece of paper. I looked at it, realizing he gave me a phone number. "When you get out of work, call me, all right?" he told me, smiling expectantly. My brain froze, not instantly sure how to process the information. I wasn't a think on my feet kind of gal like most of my friends, and this had never happened to me before. Yet he kept his expectant gaze. My brain stayed at a standstill. Okay? I reluctantly murmured. Satisfied, he walked off. Dread coursed all over as I made my way to the back room. My entire shift was spent nervously trying to think of how to approach this. I wasn't going to call the guy. I didn't want him knowing my number. I didn't even know him. Why would he want my number except for an interest in me? He's way too old for me. Was he taking my kindness as a sign I liked him? I was nice to everyone. All this did was increase my anxiety. I didn't call him that night. The next day he caught me just as I was in the entrance of the building. Looking back, I'm thankful it was where there were people. He was fuming, demanding to know why I hadn't called him. I made an excuse that I was really busy. He smiled again, just telling me that he understood and not to forget to call him tonight when I got out of work. I looked towards my shoes and he waited until I nodded before leaving. Once again, I had anxiety most of the shift, and I still didn't call him. Thankfully, he wasn't on my next few shifts. My next shift that he was on was earlier in the day. He tried to wave to me from a distance, but I acted like I didn't see him and managed to get inside before he could get anywhere near me. Around this time, I was moved to the garden center to help them out with cashiering. I also was taught basics on caring for the plants. Honestly, this was a lot of fun, and the people out here were even cooler than up in the main area. The only problem was, well, garden centers are right up against the parking lot. Half of the garden center was outside where he could interact with me. I was lucky that some of the other girls were working on the plants and I had plenty of customers to keep me busy inside. My shifts were semi-random. This night I got out at 11 p.m. We were instructed to park in the back of the lot so that the customers had the front zones. The parking lot stripes were even color coordinated for us. At this time of night, my car was one of the only remaining ones back. At the time, I drove a 1996 Buick Park Avenue. It stood out against other cars and most people of my age group saw it was an old person's car, but I loved the thing. Apparently my cart pusher coworker had taken to remembering it already, because even though I wasn't the only person exiting the store at 11, he knew to wait around its vicinity. I didn't notice him at first, but as I was walking, I eventually caught sight of his bright yellow vest. I power walked it to my car and locked the door. He continued to stride up to the car as I turned it on. I'm not sure what to do. Part of me is really uncomfortable and nervous he'll yell at me or something, yet my polite nature is too strong, and I freaking wait for the guy. I double-check that my door is locked and I roll down the window a small bit. It's enough to where I can talk to him, but he struggled to reach inside. "Hi, just getting out?" he asked. I'm surprised he didn't start off aggressive. Yeah, and you?" "I'm not out for another hour. So how old are you?" I blink slowly, completely thrown off. My brain has no time to think of an excuse or lie. 19? Why?" The words come out uneasily. Then he just smiles and lets out this casual, happy-go-lucky tone. "Oh, I just love you." I look back and forth and back at him. "Pardon?" "I love you." I just want to get out of there immediately. Thanks. I gotta go." "Okay, see you soon," he says cheerfully, but somehow the statement scares me more. I try not to rip out of there, but go calmly, feeling his gaze still watching me. But I'm on the verge of panic, so I go into our rival store parking lot and proceed to freak out. I call a friend I'm close to at the time, who I know tends to stay up late and is a rational personality type. I tell him everything, crying and shaking wildly. As the fear spills out, I begin to wonder what would have happened had we got out at the same time. Would he follow me home? Oh, I don't want him knowing where I live. What does he want with me? My friend, meanwhile, is very calm and promises to stay on the line with me. He admits he has no experience with this kind of stuff, but then I remembered one of my longtime friends does. Only, she's a little difficult to get a hold of on the phone. He isn't really close to her, but he assures me he'll try to get a hold of her through Skype. He manages to keep talking to me the whole 40-minute drive home. When I get back, he tells me that he's managed to contact her and that she'll be calling me in a few minutes. She listens to me, tells me she understands why I'm scared, even in my own room. She used to have a full-on stalker. She advises me to tell Walmart management. I'm a little worried about getting him in too much trouble, but she tells me that the behavior isn't appropriate and that he might be inclined to do something he shouldn't if I just let it sit. I agree, and the next day I catch my boss to tell her. She listens and is rational about it, but understands and helps me file a report. She tells me that he does have the right to know about the report, and it might be a he said, she said sort of deal. That, and I didn't have the paper with his number anymore. I feel a bit uneasy, but I decide to go forward with the report. That day I'm working at the garden center with 3 of my favorite people. The only guy out of the group is a fairly tall and easygoing guy named Brendan. Now Brendan tends to be the one who stacks and deals with a lot of the crazier outdoor equipment. He also was the one who took the time to show me how to care for most of the plants. While I was outside, Mr. I Love You tries to come over and wave me down with a friendly smile. I turn and go right inside, bundling up with anxiety. I'm scared what will happen at the end of my shift and am nearly on the verge of tears imagining terrible possibilities. Brendan notices I'm off and asks me if I'm alright. I reluctantly ask him when he gets out. He says that he gets out in an hour before I do, but he's sticking around a while waiting for his girlfriend, who gets out an hour after me. I ask him if he'd be willing to walk me to my car without telling him why. Despite the fact that I give no indication about Mr. I Love You, Brendan asks about him. My surprise gives Brendan the non-verbal yes. He begins to tell me that Mr. I Love You is bothering one of our other coworkers as well. She recently was thinking of reporting him too. She likes her privacy and preferred to eat in her car instead of the break room. However, lately he's taken up to staring at her while she eats, her entire break. He kept doing this every time they had left a shift together, until she couldn't stand him doing it anymore. She was older than me, about Mr. I Love You's age, but much smaller than your average 40-year-old woman in physical appearance. I guess the only requirement for his attention is that you're female. Brendan agreed to meet after my shift was over and walk me to my car. Mr. I Love You stayed very far away, staring at both of us while Brendan walked me over. I thanked him, and Brendan was sure to stare right back at the guy while I got in my car and left. I believe that Walmart receiving multiple complaints about this guy is what led them to tell him to leave us be, and thankfully he complied, as I noticed him pass me a few times when I was back in the main checkout lanes, but he refused to make eye contact. Not too long later, he straight up disappeared. I don't know if he was fired or left, but I'm glad I haven't seen him since. A few years later, I received a message from my rational friend who I had called the night the creeper told me I love you. We weren't as close anymore, so I was surprised to hear from him. He apologized profusely, admitting he never took me seriously that night. I was amazed, reassuring him that he kept me calm and contacted someone who could help me. That's all I needed out of him at the time. He told me a girl he was close to had gotten into a similar situation that I had recently, only it ended far worse for her. He thought back to the night I called him and realized that something horrible could have happened to me. I was around 19 walking the mile home from work to my dorm. I live in a city, and the road I was walking down was a 6-lane highway with stoplights. It was dark out, but only 9 or so, and I was never really concerned when walking home. So then a car pulls up and starts driving beside me, inching along. He is in the furthest right lane, impeding traffic with his slow driving, but everyone drives terrible here, so nothing too unusual. He rolled down his window and called out to me. I'm used to ignoring catcalls on my way home, happened literally every day, so I just ignored him for a minute, but he kept calling out and started to explain that he was a firefighter driving home from work. He said that he could tell that I probably was headed to the university, so let me just give you a ride for that last mile. I said no thanks. He said, seriously, I swear I'm a firefighter. Let me show you my badge. He flashes something at me. He says that he was hearing reports before he left work that it was about to start storming bad, and he insists, look, I really don't feel right about letting you walk home alone when I know it's about to start storming. And trust me, I'm a firefighter. I know what I'm talking about. I said I appreciate it, but once again, no thanks. I've continued walking this whole time, and he continued inching his car along until the latest rejection, and then he speeds off, and I think hopefully that he is leaving, but instead, he pulls into a hotel drive about 5 yards up, blocking the sidewalk. I keep walking, but walk near the road to avoid his car, but as I'm passing, he starts to get out. A little side note, I was not really worried yet. I thought this guy was a nice stranger and a firefighter. He hadn't given me too many creepy vibes, and we get a lot of different types down here. I just don't take rides from strangers for obvious reasons. But then the security guard of the hotel started walking towards us asking if everything was okay, and Mr. Firefighter got a look of panic and hightailed it out of there in a flash. Then I got scared, because it meant that he was lying that entire time, and I fell for it. He really wanted me in his car, and he definitely planned something immoral. Doesn't help my nightmares that the city this happened in, like many cities, struggles with problems of human trafficking. This happened earlier this year. I work only 2 days a week, my fiancé works the next 4, and we have 1 day off together. On his 4 days, I stay at home with our 5-year-old daughter. We have only 1 car, so that is why we work these shifts. We live on the 2nd floor of an old house near the square in our little historic town. There is a set of old wooden steps outside to get to our only door, which is in the back of the house. Normally, if someone is walking up those steps, if I am in the kitchen where the door is, I hear them. Also, I have a macaw, and he will hear them as well and either scream or start saying hi over and over again until he knows who is there. There is the bathroom right off the kitchen with a window that overlooks the yard and our parking spot behind the house. Now that the setting is complete, here's what happened. One of the days I was home with our daughter, I was in the kitchen doing dishes. With the water running, I may not hear someone on the steps, but I usually would, I think. Mama Ka, however, would hear anyone who was not trying to be silent. Someone knocked on the door. I never heard footsteps, nor did the bird. I turned the water off and asked who was there. No answer. I was not expecting anyone or any packages, and I was not dressed in clothes to greet the random public, so I didn't open the door. After a few seconds, the locked doorknob jiggled like someone was trying to open it. I went into the bathroom to see if my fiancé's car was out back, in case he had his hands full and could not get to his keys. No car. I never heard anyone walk back down the steps, nor did I see anyone leaving the steps or yard. Since I didn't hear anything else, I just wrote it off as my imagination. Fast forward to that evening, and I'm browsing Facebook. There is a local organization that posts police scanner reports on their page. People can also post things they saw or heard, or what happened to them, as a warning to others in the community. They posted that someone had been walking into unlocked homes that day and stealing small items regardless if people were home. They were checking doors and only trying for unlocked ones. A while after that, someone replied in that thread that their 4-year-old had come into the living room and asked him, her father, who the man was in the kitchen. The father just assumed the kid was responding to something she saw on TV or was making it up, until we saw the Facebook post. In further inspection, he found some small items missing from his home. The man was never caught or identified, but there were several police reports from my town that day of someone trying to open doors. Since I asked who was there before he tried to open my door, he obviously knew there was someone home, and I don't think there is any way he would not have used some kind of force once he opened the door. So creepy thief who doesn't care who is home, know that I will defend my daughter with violence if I feel she is threatened, and walking into my house will be considered a threat. Before I start, let me preface this story with the layout of my apartment. There are 4 rooms and a living space with a door that goes out into a small hallway which leads to another door which goes outside. All the apartments are built the same and have the same furniture. So last night, it's around 5:00 a.m. and I hear a buzzing at my door. I figured it's just my friend messing with me, so after it rings about a dozen times, I get up and go to the door. Now, there is a hallway that separates my door from another door, which is how you get inside. So I open my door, and as soon as I do, a 6'4" man rips open the door, which must have been ajar from one of the other people in my complex, and comes to the little crack of my door I have open and shouts,
My name is Jose. This is my apartment. I'm tired and I just want to chill.
His eyes are extremely dilated, as if though he were on every drug known to man. When I refused his entry, he turns around, and as I'm closing the door, full sprints into the apartment. So this man starts screaming that this is his stuff because he has the same TV and couch. I try to reason with him and explain that everyone has this stuff, but he calls me a liar and says he'll show me. So he goes to my friend's room, which I'm assuming is what room he has in his actual apartment, and opens the door to my friend who's naked in there with his girlfriend. He becomes furious, shouting at the girl, saying,
Courtney, how could you?
Her name is Sarah. So my friend gets up and tackles the guy where he lays until the police arrive, shouting over and over that his name is Jose and that he's just trying to chill. They ask him where his shoes went since it's snowing out, and he says they're in his jacket, but he didn't have a jacket, and why would shoes be in his jacket? So they asked him what his last name was, which he spelled out normally at first, but he kept ending with Jose. He then accused the officer of bullying and whipped out a cig from thin air and began blowing cigarette smoke in his face. He was detained, and I haven't seen him since. Moral of the story is, don't do drugs, kids. And to Jose, if you're out there, let's not chill. This was when I was 18 and lived in Aurora, Illinois. Anyone who has lived there can verify that there is a bike trail that crosses right between the city, running from east to west with a bridge crossing the river. A lot of the trail is surrounded by trees to give it the illusion of being in a forest. Near the bridge on the west side of the city, there is a homeless shelter called the Harassment House. I used to live there on the west side when I was in high school, but after I graduated, I moved to the east side because of cheaper cost of living. The friends that didn't go to the college lived on the west side, so I would ride my bike through the trails to get across the city. One day I spent most of the day on the west side at a friend's house, smoking and drinking and playing cards. I didn't leave until about 12:30 a.m. Now on my way toward the east side, I had to cross a very spooky underpass that passed next to the homeless shelter and finally crossed the bridge. Right before I was going to cross the underpass, I stopped, and then I thought for a second. Here I am, kind of out of my mind. It's almost 1 in the morning, and I'm about to cross this really shady area of the trail. I had to decide either go through the trail or backtrack and take to the streets, which would extend my bike ride an extra 15 to 20 minutes. I remember thinking to myself, screw it, it's not like I'm in Chicago, and I started riding toward the underpass. As soon as I entered the underpass, I smelt it. Crack. Before my parents' divorce, my dad used to smoke crack, and I always knew when he smoked it because of that tangy ink-like smell. I didn't even think or stop, I just started riding as fast as I could through the underpass, and when I came out on the other side, I looked to my right, and for a brief moment in time, stopped. I saw 2 figures turn and face me, and they were squatting in the bushes. They turned as if though I had caught them off guard because they were huddled together, but I just rode my bike with all my might. I looked behind me again and saw that they were chasing me, trying to run me off my bike. I've been mugged before when I lived in Chicago, but the fact that they looked like shadowy figures in the dark made it 10 times more horrifying. I could hear them grunting and panting as they tried to catch up to me. The trees covered all the street lights and I was going extremely fast. I was afraid I'd run myself off the trail and they'd try to grab hold of me. I headed toward the bridge and thought that I was home free. But then I felt a rock smash against my shoulder. They started throwing rocks at me. The adrenaline was coursing through my veins. I had never felt so alive in that moment. I passed that bridge so fast and got to a main road before I finally slowed down and looked back. I remember my shoulder blade pulsing in agony. I was afraid they had broken a bone or something. I squinted my eyes, and after a good 30 seconds, I saw the figures on the other side of the bridge. There were actually 3 of them, and they looked exhausted. They stared at me from across the bridge before finally receding back into the darkness. I rode the rest of the way home as fast as I could, and when I checked my back in the mirror, I had a bruise that encompassed my shoulder blade, and it swelled up so bad I couldn't move my arm for 3 days. Probably the most horrifying experience of my life. I'm pretty sure that they were homeless men staying at that homeless shelter, and they were getting high on the trail. I'm sure that they started tweaking when they saw me. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to check out my Choose Your Own Path horror game on the iOS and Android App Store, and grab early access to all future narrations for $1 on Patreon. Links in the description. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon. So around 10 to 12 years ago in England, I lived in a little 2-bedroom house on a long road. It is a terraced house on a long strip of other terraced houses. Back in the day, all the attics were joined, and you could literally travel through them. Years later, they realized it was a bad idea. Fire spreading, burglars, etc. And so all the attics were bricked up so each house was secure. One night, I was soaking in the bath when I heard a noise above me. Thinking it may be an animal or something, I just ignored it. This went on for a few weeks, only it was getting to the point I could only hear the noise when I was in the bath or shower or getting changed. I got a friend to check the attic, and he told me he didn't see anything. He just stuck his head inside, which then confirmed my animal story, at least in my mind. Not much happened after that for about a month or 2 when one night I was alone. I was getting ready to take a shower as I was heading out with friends. I heard the same noise above when all of a sudden the dog started going crazy, barking and looking directly above me. Clearly I was freaked out and decided to get ready at a friend's house. The next day I was outside my house when the neighbor shouted at me. Now, my neighbor is pretty creepy. Small, stinky, strange looking, with a hint of crazy in his eyes. He asked if I was okay. Being polite and trying to show him he doesn't really bother me, I said yes and went about my business. Just as I got to my door, he asked if I got to my friends okay. At first, without thinking, I said yes, thank you, smiled and waved goodbye. When I got inside my house, I realized that he would not have known I was at a friend's house unless he heard me on the phone, and as I was so creeped out the night previously, I was practically whispering it to my friend. Anyway, I rang my family members, told my dad, and they all came around. They turned the lights on in the bathroom but kept all the other lights off. Opened the attic door, and you could see 2 lights shining right through to the top of the attic. 2 tiny little holes. My bathroom ceiling was quite dark, so I never noticed them. My dad went in. He was gone a while, but when he returned, he was blazing angry. He ignored everyone and walked straight outside to the neighbor's house. We heard him shouting for the neighbor to open the door, but he wasn't home. I asked my cousin to go up to check it out. When he came back down, he told me that the walls separating the attics had been knocked through. Most of the brickwork was on my side, so it was knocked through from the other side. We called the police, but they told us that there was no proof that he had done anything. The neighbor told the police he never used the attic and the previous tenants may be to blame. Clearly that dirty old man was obviously to blame. I don't think I had ever been so disturbed knowing that old man had been watching me for all that time. I never stayed in that house again. First, I need to set the scene and give you an idea of the layout of the neighborhood. The road that my nanny, or my grandma, lived on was a dead-end road, and at the time, it was for the most part only had my family living on it. The road is actually named after my great-great-grandpa. My uncle's house is the first family house you reach in the curve, then beside him is my great-uncle. Beside him was an old 200-year-old house that my great-great-grandpa used to live in. It was old and uninhabitable except for snakes, birds, possums, and raccoons. Beside the old house was my nanny, and beside her was where I used to live until my parents bought more land somewhere else to build a bigger house. But they did pass on our old home to my oldest sister and my little nephew at the time, and around the curve down at the bottom of the hill was where my uncle had lived. Across the road was a huge piece of land that was basically an old empty overgrown field that at one point in time used to belong to our family. But whichever family member had it died, and it was sold, but the field stayed untouched for well over 18 years. My cousins and I used to ride dirt bikes over there, and we had forts and tree houses all over the place. Through the more wooded part of the field, there was another small neighborhood where Mrs. Beeler lived. She and my nanny were good friends, and what brought them together was that my nanny was a seamstress. She could make you anything. She made all of our Halloween costumes. She made wedding dresses, prom dresses, you name it, and she could make it. The police and fire department came to her to sew their patches on uniforms. By word of mouth, my nanny had a lot of customers that became lifelong friends like Mrs. Beeler. Now, Mrs. Beeler lived in a nice house at the end of the cul-de-sac of her road on a nice shaded, fairly good-sized piece of property. She was married to a nice man and had 3 daughters. She had one of those houses where the attic had a door with a staircase going up. It was actually big enough to be an extra bedroom, and her daughters did use it when they were little as a playroom area. Anyways, after her daughters grew up, got married, and moved, no one ever really used the attic anymore. It basically became a storage area, although Mrs. Beeler didn't really store much up there, so no one ever had any reason to go up there anymore. Sadly, Mr. Beeler passed away at the age of 70, and Mrs. Beeler, who was 67 at the time, found herself alone in the big house. For a while after Mr. Beeler passed, her daughters and other various family members would stay with her until she got used to the idea of being alone. After a few months, she adjusted to his passing and life went on. A few years later, Mrs. Beeler started developing signs of dementia. She became forgetful, misplacing lots of things, forgot appointments, and so on. At the time, she also started to complain of hearing footsteps in the attic at night or certain times throughout the day, and claimed that she could hear voices coming from up there. She also said that she noticed that food would go missing, and that it appeared as if someone used her dishes and washed them and left them in the sink to dry. Of course, with her having early signs of dementia, everyone just thought she was just imagining things, and that maybe she forgot she ate the food or didn't even buy it at all and just thought she did. But she swore and was very adamant that she wasn't making it up. No one ever bothered to go up to the attic to check it out to see if, in fact, she could be telling the truth. It was sad, and the way Mrs. Beeler explained the noises she heard, the voices, and the missing food and dishes, you could just tell that this lady was serious. She knew what she was talking about, and in no way would you ever believe it was her dementia kicking in. My nanny believed her and even called one of her daughters to try and see if they could at least check it out, but they said that there was no one in her attic and that her mind was getting worse. A few years later, Mrs. Beeler's daughters had her placed in an assisted living facility as it became apparent to them that she needed 24-hour care and supervision. They did have someone stay with her when she was at home during the day to help her around the house and take her to her appointments. After that, her house sat vacant for a few months, well, except for the creeper in the attic. After a few months in the nursing home, Mrs. Beeler went downhill fast and unfortunately passed away from complications of pneumonia and other health issues. Shortly thereafter, the old field across the road had been resold, and the guy that bought it wanted to turn it into a luxury apartment complex. He thought that the spot where Mrs. Beeler's house was would be great to connect an adjoining road for an alternative entrance and exit, plus the extra land would allow him to build more stuff, so he made an offer to her daughters, and they sold it. Mrs. Beeler's daughter had already cleaned it out and removed all the furniture and belongings, yet still not one of them ever bothered to check the attic. As the construction crew came to go through the house one more time before it was demolished, the guys did a walkthrough, and when they went into the attic, they found a man living in there. He was erratic and acting very aggressive, so the guys got out of there and called the cops. Come to find out, he had been living up there the whole entire time for almost 2 years. Mrs. Beeler was telling the truth after all, as my nanny and I, as well as many others, believed all along. The guy was schizophrenic. He took his medicine half the time, and when asked how he got in, he said that the sweet old lady that lived there left the back door unlocked one day when she left, so he just went in. He said he never meant her any harm at all and just really needed a place to stay. The reason why he was acting erratic and aggressive the day the construction guys came in is because he had ran out of medication and thought that they were bad men after him or something to that effect. He voluntarily went into a psychiatric facility to get help and get back on his feet, and given that he did have a mental disorder, he was given leniency. However, he was charged for trespassing and had to pay a fine or work it off with community service once he was discharged from the mental hospital. Mrs. Beeler's daughters were contacted and told that in fact their mother was telling the truth and someone was living in her attic. So, the footsteps and voices she heard were real, as well as the missing food and the dishes that were mysteriously found in the sink. They were shocked and felt extremely guilty that they didn't believe their mother all along, and felt so stupid that they didn't even bother to at least go in the attic and check it out for her peace of mind. They were also mortified at the fact that this man, if he wanted to, could have possibly hurt their mother. It's been well over 12 years ago that this happened. I never heard anything else about the guy living in the attic and never found out his name or who he was. The guilt weighed heavily on her daughters, as, in my opinion, it should. I feel really bad for Mrs. Beeler, and I'm glad that she was in some way vindicated. It's just unfortunate she wasn't alive to see it. This happened to my wife's Aunt Sarah. I apologize that I can't really relay some of her emotions and at times have to skimp on a few details, as it is a second-hand account as told to me by my wife. This was 10 or 15 years ago, and Sarah had recently been divorced. Her husband moved out, and Sarah continued living in the house by herself for some time after that. The house was in a typical neighborhood and wasn't secluded or off by itself or anything like that. As Sarah became used to living alone again, she felt like she kept hearing things in her attic and began to wonder what was making the noises that she had heard. She called the police and had them come sweep her attic looking for traces of anyone living up there, but they found nothing and told her she had probably just heard a raccoon or squirrel. In the days after the cops came to her house, she felt like the noises were getting louder and that there was no way it was a small animal. She called the police again a week later and the same thing happened. They didn't find anything yet again. A few days after the second call to the police, Sarah came home from work earlier than usual. Fortunately for her, she had started dating during that time, and her boyfriend was with her when she came home that day. As she got out of the car in her garage, she noticed something out of place and scary at the door: a pair of muddy men's boots. I'd like to think that if she had been alone, she'd have enough sense to not enter her house at that point, but luckily her boyfriend was with her. They cautiously entered the house and discovered upon opening the door a man standing naked in the laundry room doing his laundry. Sarah went to call the police, but the phone wasn't working, and she ended up going next door to use the phone. I'm fuzzy on the details here, but they managed to keep him in place in time for the police to arrive, and they took him away. Turns out that this guy had access to her house somehow, and he had indeed been spending time in the attic. The cops found a small hole in the attic above her bedroom where he had been watching her, and on that day he cut the phone line and had put a knife under her pillow. God only knows what would have happened had she come home by herself, but thankfully, that didn't happen.
Alright, so I think that since the last story ended, I think that'd be a great time to end the stream, so I don't leave you guys at like a cliffhanger or anything, but yeah. Thank you for everyone who came and watched, and I hope you all have a good one. Bye-bye.